Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we delve into the captivating realm of Greek mythology, a domain where gods and mortals engage in a cosmic ballet of love, war, and destiny. From where are you tuning in? Settle in, make yourselves comfortable, and let's begin. In the beginning, before there was Olympus, land, sea, or sky, there was only chaos. And chaos was not the disorder, confusion, or frenzy that our modern minds envision. It was something more ancient than language itself, an abyssal void, a formless, directionless nothingness. It simply was. From this primordial nothingness, the first manifestations of existence emerged. Gaia, the vast and unshakable earth; Tartarus, the dark and fearsome abyss beneath the earth; and Eros, the force of love and desire, the agent that would unite all future creation. These were not gods as we conceive them, but elemental truths that took form. Next came Nyx, night, enshrouded in shadows so dense that chaos itself recoiled, and Erebus, the darkness of the underworld, who accompanied her in the initial silence. From the union of night and darkness were born ether, the pure air breathed by the gods, and Hemera, day, destined from the outset to incessantly pursue her mother across the sky. Thus, the cycle of night and day was born, not of science, but of myth, from a family of ethereal titans who illuminated and darkened the firmament with each passing hour. Gaia, the earth, did not remain inert. Fertile and patient, from her own body she gave birth to Uranus, the vast, star-strewn sky. He was both her offspring and her consort, and as he arched above her, stretching across the heavens, the world found its first form, a celestial dome over a boundless, infinite plain. Gaia also engendered the mountains, lofty and untamed, and Pontus, the sea, which churned with a will of its own before ships or sea monsters ever troubled its waters. Together, earth and sky formed the first great union, and their congress brought forth the Titans, the primordial generation of powerful beings who would reign over the cosmos long before Zeus and his lineage ascended to dominion. They numbered 12 in all, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each vast and elemental. Oceanus, the river that encircles all; Hyperion, the lord of light; Cous, the questioner; Crius, the bearer of constellations; Iapetus, the progenitor of mankind; and Cronus, the youngest and most cunning. Among the daughters, Theia, the shimmering mother of sun and moon; Rhea, future mother of the gods; Themis, the embodiment of divine law; Mnemosyne, the memory of all things; Phoebe, the radiant; and Tethys, the nurturing sea. But Gaia's womb was not yet sated. She too birthed monstrous offspring, beings of might and dread. First came the Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges. Each possessed a single eye, ablaze like a forge in the center of their brow. They were the smiths of lightning, mighty and simple, who feared neither gods nor giants. Next, the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, each colossal and terrible to behold, with 50 heads and 100 arms, capable of shaking the very foundations of the world when roused to fury. Uranus, though lord of the sky, quaked at their sight. Ashamed and terrified by their grotesque strength, he thrust them back into Gaia's womb, into the depths of the earth itself, sealing them there, hidden beneath layers of rock and pain. Gaia groaned beneath their weight. The earth, once proud and nurturing, now suffered with every breath. It was amidst this agony that she began to scheme. But that is a tale for another time. For now, remember this. In the eldest age, before law or justice, before sword or plow, the world was not made with hands, but with strength, union, and suffering. Chaos birthed the first forms, but it was Gaia, the great mother, who gave them soil to tread upon. The union of Gaia and Uranus, earth and sky, was the first great cosmic marriage. It was not a wedding of altars or witnesses, but of necessity and nature. The sky stretched over the land, embracing it firmly, pressing down upon it with its starry body night after night. From their union came the Titans and other mighty descendants, but also a deep and growing sorrow. For Uranus, though proud and vast, was a jealous and fearful father. He saw in the monstrous children that Gaia bore not strength, but a threat to his dominion. He looked upon the Cyclopes and the hundred-handed giants with revulsion, not admiration, and with swift, cruel judgment, thrust them back into Gaia's womb, into the earth's entrails, where no light reached and no voice could echo. Gaia groaned beneath their weight. It was not merely the agony of carrying them within her again, but the betrayal of her consort, of the sky, who should have cherished her children as she did. Night after night, Uranus descended upon her, pressing the heavens to meet the earth, blind to her pain and deaf to her anguish. She could bear it no longer, and so, from her own flesh, she forged a weapon, not of bronze or iron, for such things were not yet dreamed of, but a great sickle of unyielding flint, jagged as truth and sharp as vengeance. Then she went to her Titan children, the firstborn and the most powerful among her offspring, and laid bare her suffering. "Your father has wronged me," she said. "He has imprisoned your brethren. He has silenced the womb that bore them. Who among you will aid me?" One by one, they turned away, fearful of their father's might. Only Cronus, the youngest, the most cunning, he with watchful eyes and a patient heart, stepped forward. "I will do it," he said. "Give me the blade." Thus Gaia laid the trap. She waited for Uranus to descend, as he always did, lying upon her in the darkness. And from the shadows, Cronus sprang. With a steady hand and no hesitation, he brought the sickle down upon his father. The heavens shuddered with Uranus's cry as the blade bit deep, severing the source of his power. Cronus cast the bloody flesh into the sea, and from the crimson foam that rose upon the waves, something new was born. A figure of impossible beauty, terrible and irresistible in equal measure. From that white froth arose Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, who would later make kings fall and empires burn. She set foot on Cyprus, radiant and serene, untouched by the violence of her origin. But Gaia's vengeance did not end with blood. From the drops that fell upon the earth, other beings arose. The Furies, cloaked in shadow and retribution, who would haunt oathbreakers and parricides until the end of days. The Giants, who in time would rise against the gods themselves. And the Melii, nymphs of the ash trees, guardians of the wild and ancient ways. Uranus, wounded and dethroned, vanished into the heavens, leaving the world to his children. Before his flight, it is said he uttered a final curse, one that would echo through time like a bell. "As I was overthrown by my son, so shall he be overthrown by his own." This was no prophecy he conjured, but a truth Gaia had already whispered, and Cronus had heard it well. He seized the celestial throne and cloaked himself in power. Yet from the moment he grasped it, he began to fear what his father had forewarned. Thus ended the reign of Uranus, the first king of the cosmos, and the age of the Titans began. Yet already in the womb of time, the next tempest stirred. With Uranus overthrown and the heavens no longer pressing down so heavily upon the earth, the world breathed a new air. The Titans, freed from their father's yoke, now stood proud beneath the skies. And Cronus, youngest and most cunning among them, claimed dominion over all. He was no god of chaos or cruelty, as his father had been in the end, but ruled with a wary, distrustful heart. The sickle he had used to fell Uranus remained hidden, buried in the earth or cast into the sea. Its blade was remembered, but unseen, like a secret sin. Cronus had delivered his mother from torment and his brothers from imprisonment. Yet, from the moment he took the throne of the cosmos, his mind was troubled by the prophecy that had spurred him to rebellion. His dying father's words echoed in him like a second heartbeat. He too would be cast down by his own child. So Cronus took a wife, as kings must do. He chose Rhea, his sister, a goddess of gentle strength and deep wisdom, though her name would one day be spoken in the same breath as sorrow. Together, they ruled during a time that later poets would recall as a golden age, a time when mortals, newly made, lived in peace, free from suffering, untouched by winter or war, and the fruits of the earth ripened without the need for toil. It was an age before kings had armies, before men built walls or worshipped in temples, when justice moved unseen among mankind and no one locked their doors. But such peace, as the world has always known, does not endure. In time, Rhea began to bear children, and with each birth, Cronus remembered his father's curse. He did not hesitate. The moment Rhea placed each newborn into his arms, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, he opened his jaws and swallowed them whole. He left no trace, not a cry, not a cradle, only the knowledge that they were gone, hidden in their father's belly like seeds in winter soil. He told Rhea it was necessary, that he would not suffer the same fate as Uranus, that the throne must be protected. Rhea, though proud and strong, was powerless against him. She wept, but her tears changed nothing. 5 times she gave birth, and 5 times she lost her children to the maw of her husband's fear. But the 6th time, she resolved to act. When she felt her child stir within her womb, she did not go to Cronus. She fled to the island of Crete, where mountains kissed the sky and cavernous depths yawned beneath the earth. There, concealed amongst shepherds and nymphs, she birthed her youngest son, Zeus. And from the moment of his inception, Rhea knew he was different. His cry shook the trees. His eyes opened before his first breath, and when he grasped her finger, he held it with the very strength of fate. To deceive Cronus, Rhea swaddled a stone in newborn cloths and presented it to him with trembling hands. He swallowed it greedily, believing the danger had passed. But beneath Mount Ida, infant Zeus was secretly nursed. He was guarded by the Curetes, warriors who danced and clashed their shields to drown the sound of his cries, and fed by the goat Amalthea, whose milk imbued him with strength beyond measure. And as Zeus grew, so too did the storm that would one day shake the world. Yet for now, the age of Cronus held fast. The sky was high, the earth was green, and the Titans reigned from their thrones, oblivious to the brewing wind. But within the depths of Cronus, 5 suns stirred in the darkness. And far to the west, a child born in secret watched the stars and waited. In the hidden folds of Mount Ida, where the air was thin and the wind whispered ancient names through stone and pine, Zeus grew to manhood. Raised in secrecy, away from his father's gaze, he learned of the world not from books or scrolls, but from the silence of high peaks, the rustle of leaves, and the cautious tales murmured by his guardians by firelight. He drank the milk of the divine goat Amalthea, who nourished him from birth, and from her broken horn, torn by accident or omen, came the cornucopia, symbol of endless abundance. When Amalthea died, Zeus hung her skin amongst the stars in her honor, and her memory became part of the heavens he would one day command. But he was not born for stargazing or solitude. The blood in his veins ran thick with prophecy, and his bones carried the weight of rebellion. As he neared manhood, Gaia herself began to stir. She remembered Cronus's betrayal, the pain of her imprisoned children, the Hecatoncheires, and the Cyclopes buried in the depths of Tartarus. Her vengeance had not ended with Uranus. It had merely been postponed. With words as old as stone, she whispered the truth into Zeus's dreams. And in her waking hours, she guided his steps. First, she led him to Metis, the goddess of wisdom, whose counsel was astute and whose loyalty leaned toward the future. With Metis's aid, Zeus devised a plan. To attack Cronus, a king of Titans and time, would require more than strength. It would demand cunning. Zeus returned in disguise to his father's house, and there, with Metis's art, offered Cronus a draught mixed into wine, bittersweet and thick as honey. The drink churned in the old Titan's gut, and finally, with a shudder and a groan, Cronus vomited forth the children he had long ago swallowed. They came not as infants, but grown and bright, clad in the strength of gods, reborn into a world already on the brink of war. First, Hestia, hearth and flame. Then Demeter, grain goddess. Next, proud and keen-eyed Hera. Then Hades, lord of the dead, and last Poseidon, master of the abyss. The 6 siblings stood together for the first time as one and gazed upon the throne that had cast them into darkness. They would not forget. But Cronus was not without allies. The Titans rallied to him, their brothers and sisters assembling on Mount Othrys, the ancient seat of power to the south. Oceanus stood apart, too old or too wise for bloody disputes, but the others, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, took up arms. Thus began the war the poets called the Titanomachy, the clash of Titans and Olympians, a war that tore the heavens and split the earth to its very core. For 10 years the battle raged without end, the sky darkened with storm and smoke. Thunder and fire echoed through the mountains, and the world below, still young and silent, watched in awe as its masters fought for the right to rule. The Titans held Othrys, high and ancient, while Zeus and his kin made their stand on Mount Olympus, a peak still unscarred by war. The battles were terrible and relentless. Lightning ripped the skies and giant waves swallowed whole islands. Volcanoes bled fire and winds howled like wolves. Sometimes the war seemed endless. Neither side could land the decisive blow. But Gaia, ever watchful, knew balance could not be struck without what had been long buried. She advised Zeus once more. If he wished to win, he must descend into Tartarus and release his monstrous uncles, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, whom Cronus held chained out of fear. With his brothers at his side, Zeus shattered the gates of the underworld and unleashed the imprisoned powers. The Cyclopes, grateful and eager, gifted Zeus with their mightiest weapons, the thunderbolt, symbol of sky and storm. To Poseidon they bestowed the trident with which he would command the seas, and to Hades, a helm of darkness that would render him invisible. The Hecatoncheires, giants of 100 hands, finally joined the fray, hurling mountains like stones and assailing the Titans with the fury of ancient unleashed things. With these allies, the tide turned. The Olympians advanced with a ferocity no Titan could match. Cronus, proud and unyielding, fought to the bitter end. But the prophecy, as it always does, unfolded without mercy. The Titans fell. One by one they were cast down, hurled from the high places of the earth. Zeus did not kill them. He imprisoned them as his father had before. Into the depths of Tartarus they were cast, chained in shackles forged by the 100-handed, behind bronze gates that would never rust or break. Only a few escaped this fate. Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had allied themselves with the gods, and Tethys, who foresaw the justice of their rule. Thus ended the reign of the Titans. The sky cleared, and the world, scarred by fire and war, began to heal. The throne passed to Zeus, not by birthright, but by strength, wisdom, and fulfilled destiny. Yet even as he claimed the heavens, the shadow of Cronos' curse loomed behind him like the echo of an old song. For power once gained must ever be watched, and no ruler, god or mortal, sits eternally secure. As the war concluded and the world once again lay quiescent beneath the heavens, the victors stood amidst the detritus of creation. The Titans, bound in the nethermost reaches of Tartarus, their agonized cries swallowed by that tenebrous abyss from which no echo returned, were vanquished. The old order had been irrevocably shattered. Yet, with the cessation of the martial conflagration, the gods confronted a new, perhaps more formidable challenge than any conflict: governance. For conquest may be achieved with fire and fury, but dominion demands judiciousness, forbearance, and equitable apportionment. The world was vast and untamed, replete with powers both known and yet unnamed. It could not be held by a solitary hand. Zeus, the eldest among the now resurgent pantheon, stood at the fulcrum of this nascent epoch. Though not the firstborn, he was preeminent in power, paramount in sagacity and preeminent in decisive action when exigency demanded. However, the ancient laws, etched not onto stone, but into the very sinews of the cosmos, did not vest in him exclusive suzerainty. He had two brothers, both tempered by conflict and fortified by their own inherent rights. Poseidon, who had churned the sea into a tempestuous froth in his wrath, and Hades, who had donned the helm of darkness and moved unseen across battlefields and through subterranean caverns. They too had spilled blood, risked all, and endured grievous losses. The celestial throne could not belong solely to Zeus, lest the seeds of discord be sown anew, this time among kin. And so, the three convened, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and cast lots to apportion the world's realms. Not through acrimonious debate or brute force, but by the very hand of fate were the dice cast. This was no puerile game. The casting of lots was a sacred rite, guided by that same primordial power that had manifested through Gaia's pronouncements and shaped the trajectory of the Titanomachy. They cast the bones and waited. As they settled, the world was divided into three grand dominions. To Zeus fell the heavens, the expansive firmament, the ethereal expanse between the stars and the loftiest peaks. He became the sovereign of thunder and rain, the master of tempest and cloud, and the undisputed monarch of Olympus. His voice would resonate in peals of thunder, his ire would flash in bolts of lightning, and the eagle became his emissary, soaring majestically above all. To Poseidon was ceded the sea, profound and restless, teeming with enigmas and monstrous denizens. He claimed the oceans, the rivers, and every spring that bubbled forth from the earth. With his trident, he possessed the power to cleave cliffs asunder and to whip the tides into a frenzy or lull them into placidity. Beneath the waves, he erected a resplendent palace of coral and gold, and there he reigned not merely over fish and currents, but over creatures more ancient than time itself, sea serpents, leviathans, and things whose names had never been uttered aloud. To Hades fell the underworld, the land of the dead. It was not a prize most would have chosen, but Hades accepted it with quiet resolve. He governed the shadowed realm with stern dignity, his kingdom hidden beneath the earth where no sun shone. There he became master of shadows, the arbiter of mortal souls, and guardian of riches buried deep, gems, metals, and secrets lost to ages. Though men feared his name and whispered it only when necessity demanded, Hades maintained the balance between life and death, and it was said he never breached the laws he swore to uphold. The earth itself, the very flesh of Gaia, was left as a common realm, shared by all. The mountains belonged to no one. The plains were trod by mortals and spirits alike, and the forests grew wild under no single banner. It was an in-between realm where gods might walk and mortals might glimpse them, but it was also where ambition festered and where fate would continue to work its silent will. Thus the world was ordered, sky, sea, and underworld. The three brothers, now kings in their own domains, swore not to war amongst themselves, lest the world shatter anew. They built their thrones and gathered their retinues. On Mount Olympus, high above the clouds, Zeus convened the gods in council. There beside him stood his sisters, Hera, proud and sharp as winter ice, Demeter, whose steps awakened the spring, and Hestia, ever burning at the hearth of every home. And others came, both new and ancient, Athena, born of wisdom and war, Apollo, golden and keen-eyed, Artemis, silent and swift, Ares, blood-handed, Hermes, swift of foot and mind, Hephaestus, lame but brilliant, and Aphrodite, whose smile could unravel kings. It was the dawn of a new age, the Olympian age. But though thrones were set and realms divided, the world would not remain still for long. The gods, for all their power, were not immune to pride, nor love, nor fury. And the mortals, who now began to stir across the lands, would bring their own stories, their own wars, and their own share of suffering. The heavens had been won, but peace is never simple when gods sit the throne. As the dust of war settled and the world was once again bathed in sunlight, Mount Olympus became the seat of a new, resplendent court. The Titans had held sway from Mount Othrys to the south, a rugged ancient domain shrouded in tempest. But Olympus, to the north, soared even higher, its summit wreathed in cloud and crowned with myth. The mountain was not merely a place, but a threshold, a locale where sky met stone, where the mortal world ended and the divine began. It was here that Zeus, having claimed the heavens by fate and force, convened the new pantheon of gods. The Olympian court did not mirror mortal realms. There were no paved roads leading to its gates, no heralds announcing guests, no armies stationed at its base. The gods required no walls to guard them. The very air served as their boundary, a veil too high for mortal breath. Olympus, it was said, knew no storms, no snow, no decay. Its halls were of marble and cloud. Its ceilings vaulted with starlight, and its corridors stretched wide enough for the wind to wander freely. Here the gods walked not as shadows or portents, but in full form, radiant, terrible, and more alive than anything that trod the earth below. Atop Olympus sat Zeus, king of gods and men, enthroned on thunder. He ruled not merely by brute strength, though his might was unparalleled, but by the dictates of fate and the long memory of war. His voice boomed like distant thunder. His eyes saw beyond the clouds and time. And in his hand he bore the thunderbolt, the gift of the Cyclopes, the symbol of judgment, swift and final. But even he did not reign alone. Around him stood the others, each a pillar in the new world order. Hera sat beside him, not merely as wife, but as queen, sovereign in her own right. She was the goddess of marriage, of royalty, and of childbirth, and the silent fury of a wronged woman. Proud and unyielding, Hera remembered every slight, and her jealousy would one day shape the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Her crown was not given, but earned, forged in the fires of betrayal and bound by the sacred oaths of Olympus. Demeter followed, the goddess of grain and growth. Where her feet touched the earth, the soil softened and seeds quickened. Her presence brought harvest and bounty, and without her the fields lay barren. She did not preside loftily amidst thunder and marble, but frequently walked the world below, tending to the tillers of soil and the mothers who whispered her name at dawn. She was older than most, quieter than many, yet none doubted her power. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, eldest daughter of Cronus and Rhea, and the last to be freed from her father's gut. She asked for no temple, no grand myths, no wars or lovers. She tended the eternal flame at Olympus's center and watched over every home and every hearth on earth. Her power was gentle, yet ever present, for as long as fire burned in a house, Hestia lived there too. The younger gods came in time, some born on Olympus, others delivered by strange means. Athena was the first among them, born not of a womb, but of wisdom. When Zeus swallowed Metis, fearing his unborn child would surpass him, he thought the matter concluded. But Metis did not die. She lived within him, whispering, plotting, forging knowledge in the dark. One day, Zeus groaned in agony, and with a blow to his skull, Athena sprang forth, fully grown, clad in bronze, spear in hand. Her eyes clear and sharp as flint. She became goddess of wisdom, strategy, and just war. A virgin warrior with no patience for frivolity. Apollo and Artemis followed, twins born to Leto, a Titaness who wandered long and weary to find a place to give birth. No land dared offer her sanctuary, for Hera's wrath was vast and vengeful. At last, the floating isle of Delos accepted her, and there she bore her children. Apollo, golden-haired and bright, became god of light, prophecy, music, and healing. His sister, Artemis, swift and silver, was the goddess of the hunt, of the wild, and of moonlight. Together they marked a new generation of gods, restless, radiant, and intimately bound to the mortal world. Then came Ares, god of war and slaughter, son of Zeus and Hera, yet beloved by neither. He was strength without discipline, fury without cause, and though his name was feared, he was not often honored. War followed him like a shadow, and he reveled in its chaos, yet was often bested by cunning and wisdom. His opposite was Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge, master of craft and flame. Born of Hera alone or cast from Olympus by Zeus, both tales are told. He found solace in metal, forging wonders with hammer and fire. From his hands came armor, palaces, and automatons. Though lame and misshapen, he was one of the most indispensable gods. Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and desire, arrived not by birth, but by foam. Born from the severed flesh of Uranus cast into the sea, she emerged from the froth off Cyprus, as beautiful as she was perilous. Love, lust, jealousy, and ruin followed her wherever she went. Not even Zeus could command her fully. She bound gods and mortals with a glance. And though she smiled often, it was never without consequence. Hermes, the trickster and messenger, came last of this initial court. Son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, he moved swiftly between worlds. Winged sandals on his feet, a mischievous grin on his lips, he stole Apollo's cattle on the day of his birth, sang a song to cover the theft, and became indispensable before he could even walk. He became the messenger of the gods, guide of souls, patron of thieves and travelers. Where Hermes went, boundaries dissolved. This was the Olympian court, a gathering not of saints, but of powers. Raw, flawed, radiant, and vast. They quarreled like siblings, took sides in mortal affairs, fell in love, betrayed one another, waged petty rivalries, and executed divine justice. But above all, they ruled from Olympus. They watched the world below and shaped it to their will. The age of Titans was over, but in its place came an age of stories of gods who walked among men, of heroes born of their unions, and of a world forever changed by the hands of the divine. The world now had its rulers, but peace, as ever, was a fragile thing, and fate had not yet spoken its final word. Long before men raised cities of marble or carved their prayers in stone, there were no humans on earth. The gods reigned alone, their courts high on Olympus, their domains vast and varied. The world below them was green and wild, filled with beasts and silent mountains, but there were no hands to till the soil, no voices to sing to the stars, no fire to warm the night. It was Prometheus, a titan of ancient blood, who first envisioned the shape of man. He was no friend to Cronus, nor was he counted among those chained in Tartarus. During the Titanomachy, Prometheus allied himself with Zeus, not out of affection or fealty, but out of foresight, for he possessed the gift of prophecy and knew on which side the tempest would break. Prometheus's name meant forethought, and it suited him well. He was the brother of Epimetheus, whose name signified afterthought, and never were two brothers more dissimilar. Where Epimetheus acted hastily and regretted at leisure, Prometheus saw further, thought longer, and questioned the justice of every decree, even those issued by the king of the gods. He walked the line between Titan and Olympian, old world and new, a creature of reason in a cosmos governed by passion and power. It was he who first fashioned mankind. Some say he sculpted them from clay by a riverbank, his fingers smoothing mud into limbs, his breath imparting life. Others aver he shaped them in the god's own image, upright and thoughtful, gifted with the spark of invention. But however it came to pass, the first men were made, and they were feeble, soft-skinned, slow of foot, lacking claw, fang, or fur, or fire. They were naked beneath the sky, shivering in winter, defenseless against the world's beasts. Prometheus looked upon them and felt pity. He went to Olympus and pleaded that man be granted a gift, something to help him survive, something to raise him above the level of the beasts. But Zeus refused. He saw in mortals not promise, but peril. The king god had but lately seized his throne and was wary of new forces arising beneath him. Let them live, he said. But let them fear. Let them know their place beneath the gods. Fire, he declared, was the prerogative of the immortals. Hestia's hearth flame, Zeus's lightning, Hephaestus's forge, these were not for mortal hands. But Prometheus, stubborn and just, would not yield. In secret he scaled the heavens, stole a spark from Hephaestus's forge, and hid it within a hollow fennel stalk. Bearing it down from Olympus, he gave it to men. For the first time, fire crackled beneath the stars. Smoke spiraled above the treetops. Light pushed back the dark. With fire came warmth, safety, cooking, metal, language, craft. Humanity, once cold and voiceless, began to build. And with fire came also defiance. Zeus was not slow to discover the theft. His fury was terrible. To punish mankind, he commissioned the gods to fashion a gift, though it was a curse in disguise. Hephaestus molded her from clay, a woman of flawless beauty. Aphrodite gifted her charm. Hermes imbued her with cunning, and Athena arrayed her in silver raiments. Her name was Pandora, meaning all gifted. And she was given a sealed jar, misconstrued in later ages as a box, containing the world's ills, sickness, toil, sorrow, madness, envy, and death itself. Epimetheus, ever foolish, took her into his home, despite Prometheus's warnings. And when Pandora, driven by curiosity, the god's last gift, unsealed the jar, evil unfurled into the world, like smoke from a long smoldering fire. Mankind, which had known peace in its brief golden youth, now found itself hunted by fate. Famine gnawed at their bellies. War bled them dry. Old age stooped their backs. Only hope remained within the jar, some say by accident, others by design, a flickering ember against the encroaching dark. But Prometheus's punishment had not yet run its course. For the crime of defying Olympus, Zeus commanded him chained to a mountain on the world's rim. Some say in the Caucasus, others in a place lost to myth. There he was bound in adamantine chains, unbreakable and eternal. Each day an eagle, born of Typhon or dispatched by Zeus, descended and feasted upon his liver. Each night it grew anew, and each morning the torment recommenced. He was immortal, and thus suffering could not claim him. He endured for generations, long after kingdoms rose and fell, long after men forgot the gods who had fashioned them. And yet, even in chains, Prometheus felt no remorse. He held a secret, a truth that Zeus feared above all else, that one day the king of the gods would fall, not by blade or rebellion, but by his own seed. It was this knowledge that shielded Prometheus, for Zeus could not destroy him without first learning the name of the woman who would bear his doom. Thus, the Titan waited, chained but unbowed, as mortals lit fires in the dark and told tales of the one who dared to steal from the gods. The gods, for all their glory, were not alone in shaping the world. Beneath Olympus, on soil that drank the rain and felt the sun's warmth, humanity struggled, rose, and fell again and again. Their brief, flickering lives beside the long memories of immortals still left a mark. And though Zeus reigned supreme in the heavens and Poseidon stirred the tumultuous seas, it was the endeavors of mortals that imbued the earth with both resplendent beauty and profound suffering. Later poets, surveying this protracted and winding odyssey, perceived not a singular archetype of humanity, but a multiplicity of distinct peoples. Each was birthed into their own epoch, indelibly marked by the divine benedictions and retributions bestowed upon them. It was Hesiod, the Boeotian farmer and bard, who first encapsulated these eras, meticulously delineating the grand procession of human existence into 5 discrete ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Each successive epoch, save one, was demonstrably inferior to its predecessor. At the very genesis lay the Golden Age, a period utterly dissimilar to any that followed. It transpired during the dominion of Cronus. antecedent to the gods' nascent apprehension of insurrection, and before the earth bore the unyielding burden of iron or the ravages of war. In those halcyon days, humankind dwelled akin to deities, unassailed by pain, untouched by the ravages of age, and unburdened by the exigencies of labor. The earth spontaneously yielded its bounty without entreaty, proffering harvests in every season. There existed no imperative for statutes or soldiery, nor for potentates or currency. These inaugural mortals knew naught of famine, nor malady, nor the pangs of grief. When their allotted time arrived, they did not wither or languish, but departed this life as though succumbing to slumber. Their spirits transmuted into benevolent guardians, pristine and vigilant, who traversed the world as beneficent demons, staunch protectors of justice and tranquility. Their existence was one of unblemished harmony, and their state represented the closest approximation to Eden that any mortal would ever attain. Yet, the Golden Age, like all that glitters, ultimately receded. With the downfall of Cronus and the ascendancy of Zeus, the Silver Age dawned, a period characterized by a more somber luminescence and less noble souls. These mortals attained considerable stature and robustness, enjoying protracted lifespans, yet they conspicuously lacked the sagacity and temperance of their golden forebears. They remained in a state of perpetual adolescence for a century, guileless and indolent, only to mature into rapacious and hubristic men who obstinately refused to venerate the gods or adhere to their divine edicts. They erected no sacred temples, offered no propitiatory sacrifices, and scoffed at the inviolable laws of Olympus. Consequently, Zeus, in his righteous indignation, cast them down. Their spirits did not metamorphose into watchful sentinels or benevolent demons, but rather dissipated into the netherworld, spectral and forgotten. Their lineage was extinguished by an overweening pride and flagrant insubordination, a chilling embodiment of divine dread made manifest. Subsequently, the Bronze Age emerged, forged from the very ash trees that provided the timber for spears and shields. These were not men of gentle disposition. They were beings forged for conflict, possessed of formidable strength and unyielding resilience. Their very flesh was said to be forged of bronze. Their homes were bronze. Their tools were bronze. Their hearts seemed cast from the same metal. They lived for battle and died for it, sowing the world with blood and ash. They were terrible to behold, but not wicked, merely moved by the rhythm of war drums and the clash of arms. They built no cities, wrote no poems, carved no statues. When they died, they left little behind but broken swords and empty fields. Not even the gods mourned their passing. They sank into Hades without echo or prayer. Yet not all decline is constant. From the blood and smoke of the Bronze Age arose a brief, bright light, the heroic age, a time like no other. It was not part of the descent, but an interlude of glory before the fall. These mortals were greater than those who came before or after. They were the demigods, the sons and daughters of gods and men. They built cities, sailed seas, and carved their names into the world's memory. This was the age of Perseus and Heracles, of Theseus and Atalanta, of Jason and the Argonauts, of Hector and Achilles and Odysseus. They waged great wars against monsters, against foreign kings, and finally against each other at Troy. Many died young, and many more died forgotten. But their stories endured, carried in song and stone, in epic and prayer. Some were granted a place in the Isles of the Blessed, far beyond the ocean's edge, where heroes dwell in peace and sunlight forevermore. The heroic age did not last, but while it burned, it lit the world. And then came the age Hesiod called his own, the Iron Age, where we still dwell. This is a time of suffering and toil, an old and heavy world. Men now labor from dawn till dusk, planting seeds in bitter soil, raising children amidst war and famine, growing old with pain and fear. In the Iron Age, bonds break easily between friends, between kinsmen, between guest and host. Justice, once lofty and golden, now walks with averted eyes. Lies are many, oaths are cheap, and the gods, if they still watch, do so in silence. In this age, mortals build towers but forget their ancestors. They chase gold and power and tear down the forests that fed them. It is an age of struggle, and it is said that one day even this will pass. One day the gods will turn their backs entirely. One day Zeus will hurl his thunderbolt, and humanity will vanish like smoke on the wind. Yet, against all odds, the Iron Age endures. Men still build, still hope, still tell tales of a time when mortals were golden and gods walked among them. And perhaps this hope, however fragile, is the sole gift Zeus did not reclaim when Pandora opened the jar. In the fading light between the age of gods and the age of men, there arose a generation of mortals unlike any before. Men, born not merely of clay, but of divine blood and mortal wombs, shaped as much by Olympus as by the earth. These were the heroes. Their lives were brief, their fates often cruel, but their names would echo through time like the rumble of a distant storm. Among the first and greatest of these was Perseus, the monster slayer, founder of dynasties, and by blood and deed, the progenitor of all who would one day wear a hero's crown. The story of Perseus begins not in battle, but in prophecy and fear. His mother, Danae, was a princess of Argos, daughter of King Acrisius. The king, like all kings of that era, feared what he could not control. An oracle warned him that his daughter would bear a son destined to kill him. Such prophecies in myth, as in life, cannot be bribed or reasoned with. So Acrisius did what kings so often do when faced with a truth they dread. He sought to destroy the cause. He locked Danae in a bronze tower beneath the earth, a chamber sealed against time and men. But the gods, as they so often did, laughed at mortal precautions. Zeus, in the form of golden rain, seeped through the cracks no wall could stop and fell upon Danae in her solitude. From this union, Perseus was conceived. When Acrisius discovered the child, he dared not spill royal blood directly, for even tyrants fear the wrath of the gods. Instead, he placed Danae and her infant son into a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, trusting Poseidon or chance to drown them. But the sea is as capricious as fate. The chest did not sink, but floated upon the dark waves of the ocean to the island of Seriphos, where a humble fisherman named Dictys dragged it ashore. He took them in, raised Perseus as his own, and in time the boy grew tall and strong, with the bearing of kings and the eyes of storms. But peace is never a long companion to those who carry destiny. The ruler of Seriphos, King Polydectes, noticed Danae's beauty and desired her. Perseus, now a grown man, stood between his mother and the king, a bulwark of defiance. Polydectes, unable to strike at the son without disgracing himself, chose cunning over force. He announced a mock wedding, some say to Hippodamia, and demanded that all the men on the island bring him a gift. Perseus, lacking gold or horses, boasted that he would instead bring the king a greater prize, the head of Medusa, the deadly Gorgon, whose gaze could turn flesh to stone. The task was a cruel one, and Polydectes knew it. No man who had sought Medusa had ever returned. She was one of the 3 Gorgon sisters, born of ancient sea deities, hideous and winged, their heads wreathed in serpents, their eyes accursed. Only Medusa was mortal. Her sisters were immortal, and neither could be approached without peril. But the gods, who watched the world with curious eyes, favored Perseus. Athena, born from her father's head and never one to forget an offense, Medusa, after all, had once been a maiden in her temple until Poseidon's violence and pride defiled it, lent her shield to the young hero. It was polished like a mirror, and in its reflection, one could look upon a Gorgon without meeting her gaze. Hermes, swift and wily, gave him a curved sword and winged sandals to fly, and directed him to the Gray Sisters, the gray-haired crones who shared a single eye amongst them and knew the secret path to the Gorgon's lair. Perseus, through wit and will, stole their eye and bargained for the truth. They told him of the nymphs who guarded the sacred items he would need, the helm of Hades, which rendered its wearer invisible, the cabeces, a magic wallet to contain the Gorgon's head, and the knowledge of the place beyond the rim of the ocean, where night never rises and the Gorgon sleeps amongst ancient stones. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus flew over sea and desert until he reached the ends of the earth. He found them asleep, Medusa and her sisters, coiled in a dark wood, surrounded by the statues of those who had come before. Perseus dared not look directly, and so, with Athena's shield before him, he walked backward, step by cautious step, until he was above the sleeping Gorgon. With a swift stroke, he severed her head, and from her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the warrior with a golden blade, sons of Poseidon, born unto death. As Medusa's sisters shrieked and clawed the air, Perseus vanished into the mist, cloaked by the helm of darkness. The deed was done. He journeyed back the long way, his prize heavy in his pouch, his power undiminished. On his path he passed the shores of Ethiopia, where the sea god had dispatched a monster to punish King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia for their vanity. Their daughter, Andromeda, had been chained to a rock as sacrifice. Perseus, beholding her beauty and innocence, slew the beast, turned it to stone with the Gorgon's head, and claimed her as his bride. She would follow him west, becoming the mother of his line. When he finally returned to Seriphos, Polydectes scoffed at his tale. Then Perseus reached into his pouch and withdrew the severed head. The king and his court were turned to stone where they stood. Dictys, the fisherman who had shown kindness to a mother and son, became king in his stead. The cycle of cruelty was broken, if only for a time. But a prophecy once spoken is not so easily undone. Perseus journeyed to Argos, where King Acrisius, still haunted by the oracle's words, fled rather than face the boy he had once condemned to death. Yet, fate forgets not. At the funeral games of a neighboring king, Perseus, casting a discus, struck an old man in the crowd. Acrisius, his grandfather, who died never knowing his demise was not murder, but a long foretold accident. Thus the circle closed, as it ever does in myth. Perseus fulfilled the prophecy, though not through malice. He slew a monster, rescued a maiden, founded a line of kings, and bore the weight of destiny with dignity. He would not live forever, but his name would, for from his blood would come Heracles, and from Heracles, the next chapter in the story of gods and men. If Perseus was the first great hero, Heracles was the mightiest. His name, like thunder over distant mountains, carried weight throughout the lands touched by the Hellenic breath. He was not merely strong, but larger than life itself, straddling the border between man and God, joy and suffering, triumph and tragedy. He was Perseus's great-grandson, a son of Argos and a son of Zeus. And though the gods blessed him with strength, they would curse him with suffering. His birth was itself a temporal artifice. Zeus, ever lecherous, desired Alcmene, wife of the Theban general Amphitryon. Disguised as her husband, the king of gods lay with her, stretching a single night to triple its length. From this union was born Heracles, and from Amphitryon a twin, Iphicles, mortal and unblessed. Juno, as ever, watched from her throne with a cold and bitter eye. She knew her husband's dalliances, and she knew full well the threat this child, demigod though he was, might one day pose to her own dominion. Even in his cradle, Heracles bore the mark of the divine. Juno, seeking to destroy him early, sent 2 serpents into his chamber to strangle the infant. But the babe stretched forth his chubby hands and throttled them both, one in each fist, before any nurse could cry out. From that moment, his renown began to grow. As a youth, he trained in all the arts befitting a noble: music, archery, wrestling, and chariot driving. Yet there was a wildness to him, a disquiet of soul no master or tutor could tame. Adulthood brought him love and ruin. He married Megara, daughter of the Theban king Creon, and for a time lived in peace, begetting children and defending his city. But Juno had not forgotten. In a fit of divine pique, she clouded Heracles' mind with madness. Enraged, he slew his wife and children with the very hands that had once caressed them. When the madness passed and his vision cleared, he contemplated the blood and ruin of his own house. His cries reached Olympus, but no god replied. To atone, he sought the oracle at Delphi. The Pythia, speaking in riddles, told him he must submit himself to the will of Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, his cousin, lesser in strength, but greater in destiny. Only through servitude, through suffering, could Heracles win redemption. Thus began the 12 labors, rendered so grand and terrible that even the gods took notice. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose golden hide could not be pierced by mortal weapons. Heracles cornered it in its cave and strangled it with his bare hands. He flayed the beast using its own claws and wore the hide as armor thereafter, a second skin to shield him from the world. The second was the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with 9 heads, 2 of which grew back for each one that was severed. Heracles battled it in the swamps, aided by his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized the stumps as they were severed. From the last, immortal and venomous head, Heracles collected its ichor and dipped his arrows in it, rendering them lethal even to the gods. The third labor led him to the Ceryneian hind, a golden-horned doe sacred to Artemis. Heracles pursued it for a year through hills and rivers before gently capturing it alive, earning the goddess's reluctant approval. The fourth labor took him to the Erymanthian boar, a monstrous beast of the wild. He wrestled it in the snow-laden heights of Arcadia and dragged it back to Tiryns, shackled, laughing as Eurystheus cowered in terror inside a bronze jar. The fifth task was less glorious, cleaning the Augean stables, home to thousands of cattle untouched by broom or spade for decades. Heracles, ever the problem solver, diverted rivers to wash the filth away in a single day. The sixth was to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and wings of sharp feathers. With the rattle of Athena, he startled them into flight and shot them from the sky. The seventh labor took him to the far west to capture the Cretan bull, a beast of divine origin that had sired the Minotaur. Heracles wrestled it and brought it back alive, the bull's gaze burning with salt sea madness and fury. The eighth labor sent him north to Thrace, where he tamed the mares of Diomedes, flesh-eating horses that gnashed their teeth for human flesh. He fed Diomedes, their master, to them, and the beasts grew docile. The ninth labor demanded diplomacy and bloodshed. Heracles was sent to retrieve the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Though the queen agreed to gift it peacefully, Hera sowed rumors among the warrior women, and battle erupted. Heracles slew Hippolyta and escaped with the girdle. The 10th took him to the edge of the known world, to Erytheia, where he stole the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant. He built the pillars of Heracles at the Strait of Gibraltar and fought the giant, his herdsman, and his dog all at once, before driving the red cattle back across the continents. But Eurystheus, seeking to discredit him, declared 2 labors invalid, claiming Iolaus had aided him with the Hydra and rivers with the stables. 2 more were required. The 11th labor was to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by nymphs and a dragon coiled at the base of the tree. Heracles deceived Atlas, the sky-bearer, into retrieving the apples while he held up the heavens. When Atlas attempted to foist the burden back upon him, Heracles asked for a moment to adjust his cloak and reclaimed the sky as he fled with the fruits. The 12th and final labor was the most harrowing: to descend into Hades itself and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound. Armed with naught but his strength, Heracles journeyed to the underworld, presented himself to Hades, and with the grim god's permission, wrestled Cerberus into submission, hauling the snarling, foaming beast into the land of the living. With this last task, his penance was earned. Yet Heracles' life was not yet at peace. He fought more battles, took new wives, and sired many children. But Hera's animosity lingered. In the end, it was not blade or beast that slew him, but the poisoned blood of the centaur Nessus, staining a tunic gifted by his wife Deianira, who believed it a love charm. As the venom seared his flesh, Heracles built his own pyre on Mount Aeta. No mortal dared light it until Philoctetes, a humble shepherd, stepped forward. For this, he was gifted the hero's bow. Heracles was consumed by flame, but in death he was reborn. Zeus bore him to Olympus, where he was granted immortality, and wed Hebe, goddess of youth. He became not just a hero, but a god. His labors, born of pain and guilt, became the very measure of heroism. Where others were remembered in stories, Heracles was recalled in shrines, in games, and in the hearts of men who, though mortal, dared to dream of greatness. If Heracles was the greatest of Greek heroes, Theseus was the most political, the most cunning, the most human. He was not merely a beast slayer or a curse breaker. He was a city builder, a weaver of laws, and the founding spirit of Athens, the city that would one day name itself the cradle of civilization. His story is intertwined with myth and memory, with the thunder of heroes and the whisper of politics. Within him dwelled both brute strength and brilliant reason, the dual spirit of a nation that worshipped Athena with spear in hand and olive branch on brow. Theseus was born of two fathers, King Aegeus of Athens and Poseidon, god of the sea. His mother, Aethra, lay with both on the same night, one mortal, one divine. From this dual union sprang a boy of destiny, raised far from Athens in the city of Troezen, oblivious to the grand bloodline coursing through his veins. Before his departure, Aegeus had secreted a sword and sandals beneath a heavy stone, instructing Aethra that when the boy possessed the strength to lift the stone, he would be ready to claim his birthright. In due course, Theseus grew tall and keen, restless in limb and mind. At 16, he heaved the stone aside with a grunt and a grin, retrieving the tokens of his father. Many would have taken the facile route to Athens by sea, but Theseus chose the overland path, the longer and more perilous course, believing true royalty ought to be earned, not inherited. And so began Theseus's 6 labors, not vast or divine like the trials of Heracles, but terrestrial and intimate, each a roadside monster, a terror to the common man. He vanquished Periphetes the club-bearer, taking his weapon as a symbol. He slew Sinis, who would tie travelers to bent pines and tear them asunder. He flung Siren from the cliffs into the sea, ending the reign of a man who forced passers-by to wash his feet, only to kick them to their deaths. He bested Cercyon the wrestler, overcoming brute force with guile, and Procrustes, who fashioned beds for travelers by stretching or lopping them, met his own end upon the same iron frame. Theseus did not merely survive. He cleansed the land as he passed, clearing a way for Athens itself to emerge. Upon his arrival in Athens, King Aegeus did not recognize him. Queen Medea, now Aegeus's wife, and still seething with ancient sorceries, perceived the threat the boy posed and urged the king to poison him. But Theseus presented the sword and sandals, and at the last moment, Aegeus flung the cup aside, embracing his son before the assembled court. Joy, of course, rarely lingered long in the myths. Trouble was already brewing in the east. For years, Athens had suffered under a bitter tribute. In a war with the island of Crete, Athens had been vanquished. And as punishment, King Minos demanded that 7 youths and 7 maidens be sent every 9 years to feed the Minotaur. A creature half man, half beast, born of lust and vengeance, kept in a winding labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos. This monstrosity had sprung from Minos' own hubris. When Poseidon sent forth a bull from the sea, Minos was meant to sacrifice it, but instead kept it for himself. As punishment, the gods cursed his wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with the beast. From their unnatural union was born the Minotaur, Asterius, horned and violent, a living shame sealed within the labyrinth designed by Daedalus, the great inventor. Theseus, upon hearing of the tribute, volunteered himself among the chosen. He would go not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as a hunter to the lair. Before his departure, he vowed to his father that if he succeeded, he would return with white sails upon his ship. Should he fail, the sails would remain black. Upon arriving in Crete, fate intervened once more. Ariadne, daughter of Minos and half-sister to the Minotaur, saw Theseus and loved him. She gifted him a boon, a ball of thread, a clue, and the secret to the labyrinth's convoluted passages. That night, Theseus entered the maze. Within its dark spirals, where stone bled endlessly into stone, he found the beast. They fought without words, a prince against a nightmare. Theseus, armed with skill and a sharpened blade, felled the creature, then followed the thread back to the light. He fled with Ariadne and the freed Athenians, sailing across the Aegean. Yet love in Greek tales is never simple. On the island of Naxos, Theseus abandoned Ariadne. Some say Dionysus claimed her for himself. Others suggest Theseus feared what a Cretan bride might portend for an Athenian throne. She awoke alone and wept beneath unfamiliar stars. Theseus sailed on toward home, but in his sorrow or his forgetfulness, he failed to change the sails. From the cliffs of Athens, King Aegeus saw black upon the horizon and believed his son lost. Grief-stricken, he cast himself into the sea, which still bears his name, the Aegean. Now king, Theseus did not rest. He unified Attica, the region surrounding Athens, binding its villages into a single city-state. He established festivals and games, temples and laws. He was a hero of governance as much as of combat. He ventured repeatedly into myth, fighting alongside Heracles against the Amazons, journeying to the underworld with Perseus, his reckless friend, to abduct Persephone from Hades. That journey ended in failure. Perseus was swallowed by the earth, and Theseus was imprisoned upon the chair of forgetfulness, his memory eroded by the air of death. Only Heracles, on his own quest, freed him. But time, as it always does, turns. In the end, the Athenians, weary of kings and haunted by new heroes and new philosophies, exiled Theseus. He fled to the island of Skyros, where he was betrayed by a jealous king and cast from a cliff. His bones would later be recovered by the Athenians and buried in honor. But at the moment of his death, he was alone. No crowd, no crown, no chorus. And yet, his legacy endured. Where Heracles symbolized the strength of the body, Theseus personified the strength of the polis, of the city, of law, of people bound by more than blood. Athens would rise on his shoulders, and though it would worship Athena, it would remember the king who built its bones. Long before Troy burned and long after the Titans fell, there was a journey like no other. A quest that crossed continents and gods, united heroes in brotherhood, and ended in betrayal and exile. It was a tale of dragons and oaths, of usurped kings and reclaimed thrones. And at the heart of it all was Jason, a prince exiled in infancy, a hero prepared not by war or prophecy, but by the slow, long fire of vengeance. His story began in Iolcos, a coastal kingdom in Thessaly. Jason's father had been usurped by his own brother, Peleus, a man who worshipped no law but power. Fearing the boy who might one day turn against him, Peleus sought to kill Jason at birth. But the goddess Thetis, forewarned, sent the infant away, smuggled from court and raised in secret by the wise centaur Chiron, who had trained Achilles, Asclepius, and other sons of destiny. Jason grew strong in the wilderness, Fed on honey and knowledge, his limbs hardened by the hunt, his mind by songs of kings who had fallen and risen again. Years passed. Jason returned a man clad in a single sandal. For crossing the Inaros River, he had lost one in the muddy current while carrying an old woman. The woman, of course, was Hera in disguise, testing the young hero. As he entered the city, Peleus saw the stranger with one shoe and turned pale. For the oracle had once warned him, "Beware the man who comes with but one shoe." Jason, bold but not foolish, drew no sword nor raised a cry. He spoke plainly. He was the son of Aeson and the rightful heir. Peleus, too cunning to attack openly, feigned welcome and offered a test. "If you wish to be king," he said, "then prove yourself worthy. Recover for me the golden fleece from the distant land of Colchis. Bring back that ancient prize, and I shall yield the crown." The ram had flown over the sea, and when Phrixus reached safety in Colchis, he sacrificed the beast in gratitude. Its fleece, golden as fire, was nailed to an oak in a sacred grove, guarded by serpents and shadows, watched over by King Aeetes, son of the sun god Helios. No Greek had ever gone there and returned. But Jason accepted the challenge. He summoned the greatest heroes of his time to join him, and they came not as soldiers but as volunteers, each seeking glory. Hercules came, and Orpheus with his lyre. Atalanta, the huntress, Castor and Pollux, the sons of Zeus, Meleager, Theseus, Zetes, and Calais, winged sons of the north wind, 50 heroes in all. Together they embarked on a ship called the Argo, built by Argus under the guidance of Athena. In its prow, she placed a piece of the sacred oak of Dodona, a timber that could speak prophecy. The ship itself was a character in the story, whispering warnings and guiding fate. They sailed eastward, past shores and storms, into legend. Their first trials were not of monsters, but of men. On Lemnos, they found a land ruled by women who had killed all their husbands. There Jason lay with Hypsipyle, queen of the island, and begot sons whom he would never see grow up. In Thrace, they found the blind Phineus. Tormented by harpies who befouled his food, the winged birds drove off the creatures, earning Phineus's prophecy. A path through the deadly clashing rocks, 2 cliffs that closed like jaws on any who dared pass. On Phineus's counsel, they released a dove. She flew through and lost only a tail feather. The Argo followed at top speed, and the rocks grazed her stern, but only just. Thereafter, the passage remained still. The sea, it seemed, respected those who dared. At last, they reached Colchis, a land of fire and iron. King Aeetes did not kill them on sight. Jason was a stranger, and in that ancient world, strangers were sacred. But Aeetes agreed to grant the fleece only if Jason completed 3 tasks: to tame fire-breathing bulls, to plow a field with them, sow it with dragon's teeth, and then defeat the warriors who would spring from the earth. These were not tests of courage, but of impossibility. It would have ended there had the gods not intervened. At the behest of Hera, Aphrodite struck Medea, daughter of Aeetes, with an arrow of love. She was a priestess of Hecate, versed in herbs and poisons, untouched by men, as cold as moonlight. But at the sight of Jason, her heart betrayed her. She gave him a potion to ward off fire, taught him how to cast a stone amongst the earthborn warriors so they would turn on each other, and finally led him to the fleece itself, guarded by a serpent that never slept. Medea sang enchantments, and the beast fell into a slumber so deep. Jason snatched the fleece, gleaming and soft as molten gold, and fled with Medea into the darkness. Aeetes pursued them by ship, but the lovers had bought their escape with blood. Medea had taken her young brother Absyrtus, cut him to pieces, and scattered them upon the sea, forcing her father to stop and gather the limbs for burial. The Argo escaped, stained with crime and sorcery. Their return was a pilgrimage through Scylla and Charybdis, through lands of peril and delay. At last, they returned to Iolcus, but Peleus refused to yield the crown. Medea, in vengeance, tricked his daughters into hacking their father to pieces and boiling him alive, claiming it a rejuvenation spell. Horrified, the people rose. Jason, now steeped in treachery, was exiled. He fled to Corinth, where he and Medea lived for years in uneasy peace. But Jason, ever seeking legitimacy, cast Medea aside and chose a Corinthian princess to wed. Medea, scorned and vengeful, unleashed a fury no man could endure. She poisoned the bride's gown, burning her to ashes, and murdered her own children by Jason. Then she fled, borne away in a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather Helios. Jason, broken, returned to Iolcus. In his final days, he wandered amongst ruins, forgotten. One day, resting beneath the Argo, now dry and decrepit, a beam broke loose and struck his skull. Thus passed the great hero, not in battle, not in glory, but in silence, beneath the bones of his past. Yet Jason's tale endured. For in the quest for the fleece, in the gathering of heroes, in love soured and grandeur undone, Greece found one of its most enduring myths, the promise and the price of ambition. Few lineages in Greek mythology are more marked than the royal house of Thebes. Where most heroes battled monsters or voyaged to distant thrones, the kings of Thebes warred with their own kin and waged campaigns against their own past. Their legacy is etched not in bronze nor sung in triumph, but inscribed in riddles, madness, and matricide. Even the city's very founding was shadowed by ill omens and disquiet. Thebes began with a quest. Cadmus, a Phoenician prince and Europa's brother, set out to find his sister after Zeus spirited her away disguised as a white bull. Unable to retrieve her, Cadmus sought counsel from the oracle at Delphi, who instructed him to abandon his search and instead follow a cow until it lay down. There, he was to found a city. Obediently, he wandered until the beast collapsed upon a hill. But when Cadmus dispatched his companions to procure water, they met their deaths at the hands of a serpent sacred to Ares, guarding a spring. Cadmus slew the serpent himself, and at Athena's behest, sowed its teeth into the earth. From the soil sprang armed warriors, the Spartoi, or sown men, who turned upon each other until only 5 remained. These 5 became the noble families of Thebes, and Cadmus, its king. Yet the slaying of Ares' serpent drew divine ire. Cadmus served the war god for 8 years in penance. He married Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, and the gods themselves attended their wedding. The couple received a cursed necklace forged by Hephaestus, a thing of beauty that would bring ruin to all who wore it. And so Thebes' doom began, not in hatred but in celebration, cursed by beauty and blood. Generations passed. Cadmus's daughters would meet cruel fates. Ino went mad and flung her child into the sea. Autonoe, Cadmus's daughter, was torn asunder by her own hounds after glimpsing Artemis bathing. Semele, beloved by Zeus, was tricked by Hera into demanding he reveal his true divine form and perished in flames. And Agave, in a Dionysian frenzy of madness, dismembered her own son, Pentheus, limb by limb, believing him to be a lion. But it was through Cadmus's great-grandson, Laius, that true tragedy would unfold. Laius became king of Thebes and took Jocasta as his queen. However, the gods had not forgiven Cadmus's lineage. An oracle declared, "If Laius has a son, that child will slay his father and wed his mother." As is wont in Greek sagas, the warning proved insufficient to avert transgression. Laius lay with Jocasta, and a child was born. Petrified, Laius commanded the infant's ankles be pierced and bound, then entrusted him to a servant to be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron. Yet the servant, moved by pity for the babe, delivered him to a shepherd, who in turn presented the child to the childless king and queen of Corinth, Polybus and Merope. They received the boy as their own, christening him Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, and never divulged the truth of his lineage. Oedipus grew into an intelligent and proud young man. However, whispers of his birth reached him. Seeking elucidation, he journeyed to Delphi, where the oracle imparted the very same prophecy once delivered to Laius, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, believing Polybus and Merope to be his true progenitors, Oedipus fled Corinth, unwittingly hastening toward his predestined fate. En route, at a crossroads near Daulis, he encountered a stranger, aged, haughty, and imperious. An altercation erupted over the right-of-way, and in the heat of wrath, Oedipus slew the man and his retinue, never divining that he had just dispatched his own father, Laius. He pressed onward to Thebes, which languished under siege, not by an army, but by the Sphinx, a creature possessing the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the visage of a woman. She devoured all who failed to answer her riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus responded without hesitation. Man! Defeated, the Sphinx cast herself from a precipice. Thebes rejoiced. The city's liberator was installed as king, and in gratitude, he was bestowed the widowed queen as his bride, Jocasta, his mother. Years elapsed. Oedipus reigned judiciously and fathered 4 children, Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. But a pestilence descended upon Thebes, and the oracle proclaimed the land cursed by unpunished bloodshed. Slowly, dreadfully, the truth unraveled. The old man at the crossroads, the queen's mourning, the scarred feet, the surviving servant, and the blind prophet Tiresias, who named the king as father and brother, son and husband. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus seized her brooches and blinded himself, piercing his own eyes. He implored exile and wandered the land as a wretched figure, guided solely by Antigone's hand. In the hills near Colono he found sanctuary and at last a quiet death, swallowed by the earth. His tomb a secret kept by the gods, but his sons did not escape the curse. Eteocles and Polynices fought for the throne. When Polynices was exiled, he raised an army from Argos and led the 7 against Thebes, a war that bathed the city in blood. The brothers slew each other in single combat at the gates. Thebes survived, but its soul was broken. Antigone, the last to carry the ancient honor, buried her brother despite the king's decree. For this, she was condemned by her uncle Creon and buried alive. The gods sent madness and death to his house as punishment. Thebes survived, but its royalty became a revolving door of ruin. The story of Oedipus is not of monsters slain or cities built. It is a story of fate, of how a man can do all he can to flee a prophecy and still run straight into its arms. It is a tragedy born not of evil, but of ignorance, of a man who sought truth and was destroyed by it. The house of Thebes, in all its glory, was built on the bones of serpents and riddles, and no riddle, however cleverly answered, can alter the will of the gods. Of all the wars that have ever ravaged mortal soil, none would echo louder than the one waged for the face of a woman. A war of oaths and pride, of beauty and betrayal, of gods and kings, and the fall of empires. It began not with spears or fire, but with a wedding, to which all the gods were invited, save one. Eris, the goddess of discord, was unwelcome at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the sea nymph destined to bear a son mightier than his father. In her fury, Eris cast into the feast a golden apple inscribed with 3 words that would shatter kingdoms for the fairest. The apple was claimed by Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each believing herself most worthy of its gleam. To settle the dispute, they turned to a mortal shepherd prince, Paris, son of King Priam of Troy, who had been exiled to the hills after an omen foretold he would one day burn the city of his birth. The gods brought him to judgment on Mount Ida, and one by one they offered bribes. Hera promised kingship over all men. Athena promised wisdom and victory in war, but Aphrodite, with a smile like a soft thunder, offered him the love of the fairest woman in the world. Paris's choice was love, and thus Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and later wife to Menelaus, was marked. She had countless suitors in her youth, princes and kings from all of Hellas, drawn not merely by her beauty, but by the promise of lineages that reached to Olympus. Her mortal father, King Tyndareus, feared the war her hand would ignite. On Ulysses' counsel, he bound the suitors with a sacred oath, that whoever won Helen, all others would swear to defend that union, to punish any who dared violate it. The pact was struck with laughter, but oaths once sealed bind more than men. They bind fate. Menelaus, brother to King Agamemnon of Mycenae, won her hand. His reign in Sparta was just, his kingdom strong. But when Paris came to visit under the guise of peace and guest right, he saw Helen and saw in her the prize Aphrodite had promised. Whether she went with him willingly or was spirited away remains a matter of song and shadow. The poets disagree, but when Paris sailed back across the Aegean, Helen was with him, and in that hour war began. Menelaus was enraged. He invoked the oath, and all who had sworn it answered. Ulysses of Ithaca, cunning and reluctant. Nestor, the aged wise man of Pylos. Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, colossal and grim. Ajax the Lesser, swift and fierce. Diomedes of Argos, brave and battle-hungry. Idomeneus of Crete, steady and constant. From every corner of Hellas they came, kings, princes, and warlords. Only two demurred. Ulysses, who feigned madness, sowing salt in his fields until a wily envoy placed his infant son before the plow. And Achilles, son of Theseus, whom his mother hid amongst the daughters of Lycomedes, clad in silk to escape a fate she foresaw. But the Greeks found him. Ulysses again tricked Achilles with a spear and shield amidst gifts of jewels, and the boy chose war. They gathered at Aulis, a fleet of 1,000 ships, gleaming bronze and sails like thunderclouds. But the winds would not rise. The ships sat idle, and the men grew restless. The sea's reckoning revealed Artemis had been offended, perhaps by a boast, perhaps a deer slain, and only a great sacrifice would appease her. The name he spoke was Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon. There are tales of deceptions spun to lure her to Aulis under the guise of marriage to Achilles, of her weeping mother, Clytemnestra, of the moment the blade fell, or of a last-minute rescue, with Artemis spiritedly abducting the girl and substituting a fawn. But in most tellings, the blood was real, and the gods watched as the king slew his own child for the sake of war. The winds came, the fleet sailed east, and the world turned. The Greeks trod Trojan soil, not as plunderers, but as judgment itself. For 10 years they would encamp beneath the walls of Ilion, the great city ruled by Priam, defended by his sons, Hector, noble and doomed, Paris, comely and weak, Deiphobus, Hellenic, and the others. The gods took sides. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon sided with the Greeks. Aphrodite, Ares, Apollo, and Artemis favored the Trojans. Only Zeus tried to stand above it, but even he would bend, pulled by fate and family. This was not yet the war of Homer's Iliad, which would begin in the 10th year. But the war itself had already begun, not just with spears and walls, but in the burning of oaths, the breaking of trust, the sacrifice of daughters, and the judgment of the gods. It was a war born not merely of love, but of pride, of divine rivalry and mortal vanity, of ancient curses and deeper fears. And it would end not with victory, but with fire. When Homer's Iliad opens, the war at Troy has already dragged on for 9 long years. The Greeks, those grim-faced kings who had roared across the Aegean, had settled into a grim rhythm of siege and survival. What began in fury and fire had become something colder, slower, more desperate. They had built camps of black ramparts along the coast, dragged their ships onto the sand, and sent raiding parties forth day after day, not just to fight, but to feed their armies. The war had become a slow crawl, like an old wound that would not heal, and both sides felt the infection deepen. The Trojans, safe behind their mighty walls, built, it was said, by Poseidon himself and the mortal builder with whom Apollo had served in penance, suffered but held. The fields outside the city had been long since ravaged. Their allies came from the east and north, Sarpedon from Lycia, Memnon from Ethiopia, and others, bringing fresh life to an old cause. And still the Greeks would not leave, not without Helen. Pride held them there as much as oaths. The war had become a matter of legacy, but war does not live in walls and ships. It lives in the hearts of men. And in this war, two hearts burned more fiercely than the others. Agamemnon, king of kings, stern and imperial, and Achilles, son of Thetis and Peleus, unequaled in battle, fated to die young and determined to make that death count. The dispute between these two would shake the fragile Greek alliance. It began, as so many disputes do, over a woman. On one of the many raids, the Greeks had taken captives. Among them were Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Briseis, a princess from Lesbos. Chryseis was awarded to Agamemnon, Briseis to Achilles. When Chryseis's father came to ransom her, bearing golden gifts and reverent words, Agamemnon scorned him. The old man prayed to Apollo, and the god answered not with fire from the sky, but with plague, a silent killer that swept from animal to man, filling the air with death. The prophet Calchas finally revealed the truth. Agamemnon, forced to give up Chryseis to save his army, did so, but in return demanded Achilles' Briseis as compensation. It was an insult Achilles could not abide. He rose from council in fury. He called Agamemnon a greedy coward and swore by the gods. He would fight no more for the Greeks. Let them bleed without him. And so he withdrew to his tent. And with him went the Myrmidons, his elite warriors, silent and deadly, forged for war. From this moment, the tide turned. Without Achilles, the Greeks began to suffer. The Trojans pressed harder. Hector, son of Priam and Troy's champion, led the charge with a silent, noble fury. He was not Paris, who had brought the war, nor Deiphobus, who sought glory. Hector was the heart of the city, a husband, a father, a prince who carried the burden of his people not in pride but in duty. Day after day, the Trojans pushed the Greeks back towards the sea. Ships were set ablaze. Heroes fell. Protesilaus, the first Greek to leap ashore, had died in the first clash. Now Patroclus, Achilles' friend and companion, watched the losses mount with growing despair. Some say Patroclus was a friend, others a lover, but all agree he was the only one who could reach Achilles in his grief and rage. When the Trojans breached the Greek defenses and threatened to set fire to the ships, Patroclus implored Achilles to let him fight in his stead. He donned the hero's armor, mounted his chariot, and led the Myrmidons into battle, and for a time the Greeks rallied. But Patroclus, exultant in borrowed glory, pressed too far. He reached the gates of Troy and there encountered Hector. Their duel was brutal and ended with Patroclus falling beneath Hector's spear, and with him, any peace that lingered in Achilles' heart. When Achilles learned of his death, his grief shook the camp. He did not weep like a man. He howled like a storm god filled with wrath and ruin. He returned to the fray not for glory, not for oaths, but for vengeance. His mother, Thetis, brought him new armor forged by Hephaestus himself. Bronze that gleamed like the sun, a shield etched with the history of the world. Then Achilles went to war. None could stand against him. He slaughtered men by the dozens, chariots overturned, blood staining the dust. He chased Hector around the walls of Troy thrice before they met in single combat. Hector fought bravely, but Achilles was a fire no water could quench. He felled Hector, ran him through, and in fury dragged his body behind his chariot, circling the city day after day, denying the slain prince the dignity of burial. It was Priam, the old king of Troy, who put an end to that madness. By night, guided by Hermes, he crept into the Greek camp and knelt before Achilles. He kissed the hands that had slain his son. He spoke not as a king, but as a father, and Achilles finally wept. He returned Hector's body and granted Priam safe passage. For a moment, there was silence in the war. But peace, as ever, was fleeting. Achilles would not survive the war. A poisoned arrow, some say, shot by Paris, others guided by Apollo, struck his heel, his only vulnerable part. He died in the dust, young and unmatched, and the war dragged on without him. The Iliad ends not with the fall of Troy, but with a funeral and a shared mourning. Yet the war still loomed. The gods were not done, nor were the Greeks. The wooden horse had not yet been carved. The gates had not yet opened, but blood had been spilled, and the tide would soon turn. The war had bled the land dry. 10 years of siege had reduced warriors to husks, kings to ghosts, and heroes to memories. Troy, once gilded, stood behind its ramparts like an old lion encircled by wolves. Priam's sons fell one by one. Hector, the city's shield, slain by Achilles. Troilus, cut down as a mere boy. Polydorus, massacred in treachery. The Trojans fought with the desperation of men defending not stone, but history. Yet they held on year after year as the Greeks grew weary and restless by their smoking campfires. Then, as the gods began to turn their gaze elsewhere, the Greeks vanished. At dawn, the Trojans climbed their towers and saw no sails upon the sea. The ships were gone. In their stead, upon the plain outside the Scaean gate, stood a colossal wooden horse, tall as a temple, its flanks stitched of smooth, planed cedar, its mane carved in homage to Poseidon. No soldier stirred, no weapon clashed. The war, it seemed, had ended in silence. Troy did not rejoice easily. Priam, old and wary, questioned what he saw. Others urged caution. But it was Sinon, a wily Greek left behind, who flung wide the city's fate. Feigning desertion, he spun a tale so cunning it might have sprung from Odysseus's own lips. The horse, he said, was an offering to Athena, a token of peace left behind after the Greeks' departure. Should the Trojans bring it within their city, it would ensure their dominion for generations. But should they dare destroy it, ruin would follow. Only Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, spoke truth. "Beware the Greeks bearing gifts," he warned, and hurled a spear at the horse's flank. The wood groaned. Something stirred within. But at that moment, as if the gods themselves grew tired of warning men, a pair of sea serpents, vast and coiled, their eyes like embers, surged from the surf and crushed Laocoon and his sons in their coils. The people, seeing this, called it a sign. Troy had refused the gods' gift once before. They would not do so again. With ropes and wheels, with cheers and hymns, they dragged the horse within their walls. That night, as the city feasted and its fires died to embers, a door in the belly of the beast creaked open like thunder. Out stepped Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, Diomedes, and others, hand-picked for their cruelty and cunning. At that precise moment, the Greek fleet, concealed on the nearby island of Tenedos, silently re-emerged under the cloak of night. Troy slept. What ensued was not warfare. It was a massacre. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, stormed the palace like a dark tempest. He slew Priam at the altar of Zeus, the old king's blood saturating the very stones. Cassandra, Priam's daughter and accursed prophetess, was dragged screaming from Athena's temple, her pronouncements once again falling on deaf ears. Hecuba, the queen of Troy, witnessed her sons perish and her city consumed by flames. The Greeks exhibited no quarter. Astyanax, Hector's infant son, was hurled from the ramparts, ensuring no future hero might rise. Temples were desecrated, women taken captive, and the city of Troy, once the jewel of Asia, was delivered to the inferno. Helen, whose visage launched 1,000 ships, was discovered within the palace. Some recount that she wept and pleaded for absolution. Others maintain she remained imperious, unbowed by the devastation. Menelaus, blade in hand, met her gaze and cast aside his sword. He escorted her back to Sparta, and the war finally exacted its ultimate toll. As dawn painted the plain, naught remained but smoke and ash. The walls had crumbled, the gods turned their eyes away, yet the war did not conclude cleanly. The victors bore their own curses. Ajax the Lesser, who defiled Cassandra within Athena's sanctuary, met his end drowned at sea. Agamemnon, returning home with Cassandra as his prize, was assassinated in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra. The house of Atreus bled onward. Menelaus and Helen returned to Sparta, but their names would forever be tarnished. Diomedes, Nestor, and others faded into obscurity or exile. Odysseus, cursed by Poseidon, would not sight home for 10 arduous years. His saga, a convoluted odyssey of shipwrecks and monstrosities, would become his own legend, sculpted by divine wrath and profound loss. Only Aeneas, son of Anchises and Aphrodite, escaped Troy, his father upon his back and his son by his hand. Guided by omens and celestial bodies, he bore the dying embers of Troy westward, toward Italy. From his lineage, so the Romans would later attest, sprang Romulus, Remus, and an empire that would eclipse even Troy in grandeur. The fall of Troy was not merely the demise of a city. It marked the conclusion of an epoch, the heroic age, when men communed with gods, when glory held precedence over peace, and when destiny was etched into flesh and stone. The wooden horse, the conflagration, the perfidy, the grieving women. These were the final notes of a song that began with an apple and ended in ruin. The walls that had withstood a decade of siege crumbled in a single night, and the ashes of Troy drifted to sea, borne by winds that cared not who had won. The fall of Troy was not the end of the story, but the beginning of another kind of tragedy. One waged not on open fields or walled cities, but on dark seas, on stormy islands, and in the ruined halls of once proud kings. For those who survived the war, the journey home would prove more perilous than the war itself. The gods, unappeased by Troy's plunder, turned their wrath upon the victors. The winds that had once borne them to war now scattered them like leaves across the face of the world. Agamemnon, the high king, returned first, or so it seemed. He sailed with Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess taken as concubine, and brought with him spoils, stories, and the shadow of a crime. The gods had not forgotten the sacrifice of Iphigenia, his daughter, slain to appease Artemis before the war began. And in Mycenae, Clytemnestra, queen, mother, and widow in all but name, had not forgotten either. She had taken a lover in Agamemnon's absence, Aegisthus, a cousin with his own score to settle, scion of the accursed house of Atreus. Together, they plotted murder beneath the roof Agamemnon had built. When the king returned, triumphant yet weary, he strode into his palace as into a trap. Some say he was stabbed in his bath, others that Clytemnestra wrapped him in a robe and felled him with an axe. Cassandra died too, screaming in a tongue no one would hear, murdered on the threshold of a foreign land. Clytemnestra, blood-soaked and unrepentant, stood over her husband's body and claimed the deed as justice. In that house, vengeance had become tradition. In time, vengeance came again. Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, returned from exile and slew both mother and lover, spurred by Apollo and hounded by the Furies, ancient goddesses who punished parricide with madness. His was a tale of blood and absolution, one that would echo in Athenian courts and myths for generations. But his was not the only journey home. Twisted by divine hands, Menelaus and Helen wandered the seas long blown south to Egypt by contrary winds. Some accounts posit that the Helen who journeyed to Troy was a mere phantasm, with the actual woman having remained in Egypt the entire duration, ageless and awaiting, while a war raged in her spectral wake. Others contend she willingly accompanied Paris, and that Menelaus, weary of conflict and yearning for concord, ultimately forgave her. They eventually returned to Sparta, ruling together in an oppressive, taciturn peace. Yet Helen's name, once a poetic ode, had become anathema, and Sparta would never again attain the zenith of its former glory as it had on the day of her departure. However, it was Odysseus whose Odyssey became the most widely recounted, the most melancholic, the most enduring. Following Troy's fall, He sailed not homeward, but into a decade-long trial at sea, ensnared between Poseidon's wrath and fate's capricious whims. He was no innocent. Odysseus had conceived the stratagem of the wooden horse and led the sack of Troy, thereby desecrating temples and incurring the gods' ire. Poseidon, in particular, had marked him for retribution. Odysseus's vessel was hurled from isle to isle, each more surreal than the last. He blinded Polyphemus, the Cyclops and son of Poseidon, escaping under the cunning appellation of Nobody. He consorted with Circe, the sorceress who transformed his men into swine, and with Calypso, the sea nymph, who detained him as her paramour for 7 protracted years. He ventured to the netherworld's threshold, communed with the departed, and heeded the siren's beguiling song, lashed to the mast while his crew navigated with ears plugged by wax. He sailed between Scylla and Charybdis, lost all his men to tempest and folly, and finally washed ashore, solitary, on the Phaeacian Isle. There, moved by his tale, they granted him a ship and safe passage. At long last, he arrived in Ithaca, clad in rags and cloaked in silence, his beard long, his gaze steely. There, in his prolonged absence, suitors had invaded his domicile, feasting and plotting to espouse his wife, Penelope, who had waited, perpetually weaving and unweaving the same shroud by candlelight. Odysseus, aided by his son Telemachus, his loyal swineherd, and the bow only he could string, dispatched the suitors one by one. The great hall ran crimson with blood. Peace returned, but only fleetingly. The cycle of conflict and vengeance was never far distant. Many others fared far worse. Ajax the Lesser was felled by Athena for his transgressions. Diomedes, though valorous in war, returned to find his wife faithless, and his city turned against him. He wandered west, founding cities that dissolved into legend. Philoctetes, who slew Paris with the bow of Heracles, found no welcome home and became a wanderer. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, was slain at Delphi, cut down at Apollo's altar, perhaps in penance for the blood he spilled at Troy. The Trojan War had promised glory. It had delivered only ashes. The heroes who had once stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the walls of Ilion returned to broken homes, bitter wives, hostile gods, and the hollow echo of songs that no longer matched the truth. In the end, there were no victors, only survivors. Before the walls of Troy were razed, before heroes lifted shields or ships touched the wine-dark sea, there was a deeper current of power, older than man, older even than war, the dominion of the gods. Their stories are often whispered beneath the tales of mortals, but it was the Olympians who wove the very fabric of fate, and it was not always they who reigned. Before Olympus, there was chaos, and after chaos came Gaia, Uranus, Cronus, and the slow, violent birth of divine order. The age of the Titans had ended in fire and thunder. Zeus, the youngest son of Cronus, had risen against his father, freed his siblings from the sky god's gut, and cast the Titans into the black pit of Tartarus. In their stead arose the Olympians, 12 in number, though their names and thrones shifted with time. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Hermes. On Mount Olympus, they built a new order, no kinder than the last, but starker, more complex, and far more entangled with the fates of mortals. Zeus reigned from his golden throne, lightning ever at his reach, his voice echoing between gods and men. But his reign was born not solely of strength. He was a king who understood alliances, who rewarded loyalty and punished treachery. He divided the world amongst his brothers, the sky for himself, the sea for Poseidon, and the underworld for Hades. The earth and Olympus, they shared an uneasy balance. Around them, the new pantheon took shape. Hera, his sister and queen, ruled as goddess of marriage and childbirth. Though her days were spent in fury and suspicion, for Zeus was never faithful. His liaisons were countless with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women. each union producing offspring who would shake the world: Heracles, Perseus, Helen, Minos, and many others. Hera, ever watchful, punished their paramours and their offspring with wrath, cold, and enduring. Beside them stood Athena, born not of a womb, but from the very skull of Zeus. Fully formed and armed, the goddess of wisdom and war. She favored mortals who employed cunning over brute strength, Odysseus above all, and guided cities like Athens to flourish under law and reason. Unlike Ares, who reveled in slaughter, Athena's warfare was disciplined and precise. Her presence marked the Olympian age as one of intellect as much as might. Apollo and Artemis, twin children of Leto, brought light and shadow in equal measure. Apollo, golden-haired and radiant, reigned over prophecy, music, and healing. He claimed the oracle at Delphi, speaking in riddles through the Pythia, shaping kings and battles with a few cryptic words. Yet he could also bring plague, as he did upon the Achaeans at Troy. Artemis, his sister, roamed the forests untouched by men, a huntress and protectress of the wild. She sought no permission and offered no pardon to those who trespassed her sacred groves. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, kept the earth fertile, save when her daughter Persephone was abducted by Hades. In her grief, Demeter let the crops wither, and from her sorrow the seasons were born. Her myth echoed through every field, every cold winter and every warm spring, a cycle of mourning and return. Aphrodite, said by some to have arisen from the sea foam where Uranus's severed flesh fell, ruled over love and desire. Her beauty drove gods and mortals to madness. She bound men's hearts to ruin and pleasure alike. In the halls of Olympus, she was wed to Hephaestus, the lame smith god. Yet she gave her heart and body to Ares, the god of war. Together, they personified the chaos of passion and conflict. Hermes, swift son of Zeus, moved between worlds as messenger, thief, and guide of souls. He was the god of boundaries, both their keeper and their transgressor. No door was shut to Hermes. He walked freely from Olympus to Hades, from feast to battlefield, a smile ever playing on his lips. This new pantheon did not rule in silence. The Olympians were not distant creators. They were meddlers, busybodies, favoring some and waging subtle wars through mortal hands. In stark contrast to the Titans, who embodied elemental forces, the Olympians were anthropomorphic reflections of human nature magnified to a divine scale. Their loves were tempestuous, their grudges eternal, their pride immeasurable. They aided or obstructed at the whim of their passions. Cities were founded in their honor, sacrifices were immolated for their favor. Oracles spoke their will, and every hearth held a flame for Hestia, goddess of the home, who asked little and bestowed peace in return. Yet beneath all their grandeur lay a constant truth. Their power, though vast, was not absolute. They could be bound by oaths, deceived by mortals, and ultimately undone by time. Even Zeus, in his ascendant glory, was haunted by the selfsame fear that had doomed his father, that a son of his own would one day rise to depose him. His union with Thetis was thus abandoned. She was wed instead to the mortal Peleus, so that Achilles, their offspring, would die young and not ascend. In this, the Olympians were not dissimilar to men. They feared loss, clung to their thrones, and struggled to maintain their order intact. But for a time, they reigned. Their names etched into every marble temple, their deeds sung in every ballad, their likenesses carved onto shields and coinage. The age of heroes had passed, but the gods still held dominion over the world of men. And yet, from distant lands and whispered prophecies, there came the faintest echo of change. New gods stirred beyond the horizon. Temples would not be full forever, but Olympus, for now, still stood. The Olympians were powerful, but they were not unchallenged. Even as temples to Zeus reached for the heavens, and Athena's wisdom illuminated the minds of city-states, darker gods walked the earth. Gods of wine and madness, of death and rebirth, of things not inscribed upon public altars, but whispered in secret groves and torchlit caverns. Foremost among them was Dionysus, the last to take his seat upon Olympus, and the only one who truly stood between the divine and the wild. Dionysus was no ordinary deity. His very birth defied the laws of nature and propriety. He was the son of Zeus and Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes. When Semele, tricked by Hera, demanded Zeus reveal his true divine form, she was consumed by his thunderous radiance. Nevertheless, from her ashes, Zeus extricated the unborn child and sewed him into his own thigh. Months later, Dionysus was born anew. Twice born, they would call him. And from the moment of his second birth, his path diverged from any other Olympian. He was raised not on Olympus, but in the far-flung corners of the world, among nymphs in Nysa, in the caverns of India, in the company of satyrs and maenads. He wandered, not ruling from a throne, but roaming with flute and vine, his reveling procession following in ecstatic dance. Where he trod, vineyards bloomed and reason faltered. He was not merely the god of wine, but of alteration, of that sacred razor's edge between civilization and chaos, between ecstasy and insanity. He inspired joy, yes, but also frenzy. And in frenzy, men and women alike could forget who they were. His arrival in Greece was not without resistance. Cities mocked his rites, kings forbade his worship. One by one, he punished them. In Thebes, his mother's homeland, the young god returned, disguised, his followers stirring up disorder with drums and cries. Pentheus, the rigid king, sought to suppress the madness. He arrested Dionysus, scoffed at the wild rites, and sought to spy on the women in the hills. But the god lured him into the woods, clad in women's garb. And there, in a trance of divine madness, his own mother, Agave, led the maenads in tearing him limb from limb. Only when she returned to the city with her son's head on a thyrsus did the spell break, and the lessons settle like a shadow over all Thebes. Dionysus was the god of theater as much as intoxication, of masks and performance, of truths hidden within lies. His festivals became the heart of Greek drama, where comedies and tragedies alike were performed in his honor. Through masks and song, the Greeks gave form to fears and desires they dared not speak aloud. To worship Dionysus was not to bow to power, but to surrender to it utterly. And with Dionysus came something new to the Greek world: mystery cults, religions of initiation, secrecy, and rebirth. Unlike the formal rites of Olympus, the mystery cults promised something personal. In the Eleusinian mysteries, followers of Demeter and Persephone reenacted the story of a lost daughter's descent into and return from death and rediscovery. The Orphics, adherents of the mystic poet Orpheus, spoke of Dionysus as a god torn asunder and resurrected, a deity whose suffering imparted wisdom and whose rites promised liberation from the cycle of rebirth. These mysteries did not disavow the Olympians, but moved beneath them, more silent and profound. They offered hope where the thunderous gods gave only laws. They whispered of a soul that could endure, that could transcend the mortal frame. And in that promise, old certainties began to tremble. Even on Olympus, fissures started to appear. The gods quarreled more bitterly. Ares and Athena vied for the hearts of warriors. Apollo fell in love too often and too fatally, slaying Hyacinthus, Daphne, Cronus, leaving death and transformation in his wake. Aphrodite, jealous and capricious, punished mortals for the very desires she stirred. The gods began to resemble the mortals they ruled, proud, fickle, wounded, and lost. In Dionysus, the Olympian order found its mirror and its undoing. He was divine, and yet he lived as a wanderer. He brought joy, but he left madness. He overthrew kings and elevated peasants. And most importantly, he changed the nature of divinity itself. The gods were no longer remote and eternal. Through mystery, through ritual, through wine and song and madness, mortals could feel the breath of God within them, not in temples, but in themselves. And somewhere in the distance, Beyond the wine-dark seas and the marble columns, new gods stirred. Rome was rising, the world was changing, and Olympus, with all its thrones and thunder, could already feel the wind shifting on the mountaintop. The Olympians, for all their immortality and glory, did not confine their stories to the high halls of Olympus. They descended again and again into the world of men in the guise of lovers, tempters, warriors, or punishers. They mingled with mortals and left behind not just oracles or omens, but children. These children of gods and mortals, demigods, were born into a world that neither fully embraced nor could entirely contain them. Some became kings, others monsters, but a few became legends. Their tales outlasted the walls of Troy, or even the temples of the gods who begat them. Foremost among them was Heracles, the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal queen of Thebes. His conception was marked by deceit. Zeus visited Alcmene in the guise of her husband, prolonging the night so that it might last twice its usual span. From this deception, Heracles was born, already shadowed by the wrath of Hera. For Hera, the queen of the heavens, could never abide her husband's infidelities, and she made Heracles' life a crucible of torment. Still in his cradle, she sent serpents to dispatch him, and the infant strangled them with his own hands. Heracles grew to manhood, a man of impossible strength. But it was not brute force that defined his legend. It was penance. In a fit of divinely sent madness, Hera's vengeance again, he slew his wife and children. Tormented by grief, he sought purification at the oracle of Delphi. There, he was bid to serve Eurystheus, a petty king, and complete 12 labors, each more impossible than the last. He wrestled the Nemean lion, whose hide no blade could pierce. He slew the Lernaean hydra, cauterizing each writhing neck. He captured the Erymanthian boar, cleaned the Augean stables in a single day, drove off the Stymphalian birds, and tamed the Cretan bull. He stole the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, took the kine of Geryon, fetched the golden apples of the Hesperides, and descended into Hades to bring back the hound Cerberus. Each trial was more than a feat of strength. They were encounters with death, with the edge of the world, with the very fabric of mortal suffering. Through them, Heracles became more than a hero. He became a symbol of mortal resilience, of pain redeemed by endeavor. In his death, poisoned by a tunic steeped in the blood of a centaur, he built his own pyre and mounted it, mortal no more. The gods bore him to Olympus, where even Hera at last accepted him as divine. He became the sole mortal to join the pantheon, a god forged in agony. Yet Heracles was neither the first demigod nor the only one whose story shaped mortal destiny. Long before him came Perseus, another son of Zeus, born of Danae, who had been immured in a tower of bronze because of a prophecy that her son would slay his father. But fate, once set in motion, cannot be locked away. Zeus visited her not as a man, but as a shower of gold, and from that union, Perseus was born. Cast adrift at sea in a chest, mother and son survived and were taken in by a kindly fisherman. But again the lust of a king, this time Polydectes, who desired Danae, set Perseus on a path of peril. Tasked with procuring the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze petrified men, Perseus embarked upon his quest, divinely armed. Hermes bestowed upon him a sword, Athena, a polished shield. He pilfered the eye from the Grey Sisters, wizened crones who shared a single vision amongst them, and thereby ascertained the Gorgon's lair. Guided by Athena, he approached while Medusa slumbered, employing the mirrored surface of his shield to strike without direct sight, severing her head. From her neck sprang Pegasus, the winged steed, and Chrysaor, a warrior of gold. Perseus escaped with their aid, and on his return journey rescued Andromeda from a sea monster, wedded her, and founded dynasties. His lineage would eventually trace to Heracles, their sagas intertwined by blood and fate. There were others, Theseus, son of Poseidon or Aegeus, depending on the telling, who slew the Minotaur within the labyrinth of Knossos, bringing Athens its nascent taste of empire. Bellerophon, rider of Pegasus, who vanquished the Chimera, yet flew too high and fell. Atalanta, raised by bears and swift as the wind, at times deemed daughter of Artemis, who raced her suitors and vanquished Hippomenes, only to be undone by love and distraction. The demigods knew no peace. Their blood was too divine for comfort, too mortal for eternity. The gods watched them with pride and dread, for each tested the boundary between Olympus and earth, and mortals revered them not only for their triumphs, but for their struggles. They suffered, bled, and sometimes died. But in doing so, they became immortal in a way the gods never could, through story. As the memory of Troy faded, as cities rose and fell, the tales of these children endured. They filled temples and pediments, echoed in poems and plays. And though the gods remained on Olympus, remote and increasingly silent, it was in the lives of their mortal offspring that humanity found its mirrors, flawed, courageous, doomed, and glorious. In the realm of Greek myth, power did not reside solely in the hands of gods or heroes. There was something more ancient, something more profound, resonating beneath every choice and every death, every victory and every suffering. Fate. It was not a god, though the gods themselves feared it. It was not a law, though it governed even the divine. Fate was a truth, a force akin to gravity, unseen yet inescapable, woven into the very sinews of the world. The Greeks called her Moira, and sometimes she had faces, the Moirai, or Fates. Three sisters who spun, measured, and cut the thread of every life. Clotho spun the thread. Lachesis measured its length. And Atropos, she who could not be bypassed, cut it when the time came. Even Zeus, king of Olympus, was bound by their decisions. He could thunder and plead, but if Atropos raised her shears, no power in heaven or earth could stay her hand. And so, if fate ruled all, what hope had man? The answer lay in omens and oracles, the strange, subtle language of the gods, and the signs sent to those who dared to read them. The Greeks did not believe they could change their destinies, but they believed they could understand them. To see the future was to prepare for it, to try, perhaps in vain, to ready the soul. The most famous oracle in all of Greece was at Delphi, where Apollo spoke through the Pythia, a woman seated on a tripod over a steaming chasm in the temple's stone floor. She inhaled vapors, fell into a trance, and delivered the gods' words in riddles and fragments. Kings, generals, and common men came to her, some to seek glory, others merely survival. But her words were never direct. Apollo did not deal in certainties. A prophecy, like a blade, could cut both ways. Thus, many stories twisted around her cryptic pronouncements. Croesus, king of Lydia, asked the oracle if he should wage war against the Persians. It told him that if he crossed the river, he would destroy a great empire. He failed to realize the empire would be his own. Oedipus, too, was warned that he would kill his father and marry his mother. His parents tried to thwart the prophecy by abandoning him. He, in turn, fled his supposed home to avoid fulfilling it, only to run straight into its clutches. The oracle, as ever, had been correct. It was men's misinterpretations that doomed them. There were other oracles, too, at Dodona, where the rustling of sacred oaks revealed the will of Zeus, at Delos, where Leto gave birth to Apollo and Artemis, at Ammon, in Libya, and in countless lesser shrines, where dreams, animal entrails, birds in flight, or the flicker of a flame gave voice to the unknowable. In warfare, omens were sought before every battle. A flash of lightning, a flight of crows, a sneeze at the wrong moment. These were not trivialities. They were warnings, communications from the divine. A general who ignored them would risk not only defeat, but cosmic retribution. Sacrifices were made before sea voyages, births, marriages. The entrails of goats and the livers of oxen were studied by seers who divined the will of the gods in dark, wet patterns of muscle and blood. The art of reading omens had become its own power. Seers like Calchas, who guided the Greeks to Troy, or Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, held sway equal to kings. Tiresias, in particular, touched by both male and female life, was said to have lived 7 generations. His was unequaled wisdom, his visions sometimes a curse to those who sought them. But oracles and omens were not mere superstition. They represented something deeper, the Greek understanding that mortals were not in control. No matter how mighty the hero, how noble the lineage, how true the heart, the wheel of fate spun on, and in its turning, all would one day be broken. The gift of prophecy was not power, it was awareness, and awareness all too often was indistinguishable from tragedy. Still, men sought prophecy. They climbed mountain paths to Delphi, brought gold and goat's blood, asked questions in trembling voices. For though fate could not be changed, it could be met. To know the storm was coming was not to stop it, but perhaps it was to die with one's eyes open. In this tension between knowledge and impotence, between the known and the feared, the Greeks found meaning. Their stories were not about victory over fate, but dignity within it. Even the gods watched the loom of destinies, unable to cut the threads they did not like. Hector knew he would die, and yet he donned his armor. Achilles knew he would not return, and yet he sailed for Troy. Oedipus tried to flee his doom and instead ran headlong into it. And the Pythia kept breathing year after year, whispering riddles in the smoke. Her voice the cold breath of a world that had already decided what would come. For the ancient Greeks, death was not the end of the story, but merely the end of breath. What followed was not heaven or hell in the Christian sense, but a realm all the more neutral for being older. A land beneath the earth where all the dead, great and small, noble and villain, made their final journey. This place was Hades, named for the god who ruled it. And though it possessed no flames, no pitchforks, nor horned demons, it inspired a dread so profound that mortals rarely spoke the god's name aloud. They called him Pluto, the rich one, instead. For all riches, all veins of silver and gold came from beneath the earth, and hence too came the dead. The geography of the underworld was shaped not by logic, but by myth and memory. On its threshold ran the 5 rivers: Styx, the river of hate and sacred oaths; Acheron, the river of sorrow; Phlegethon, of fire; Cocytus, of lament; and Lethe, of forgetfulness. Each marked a boundary, not merely physical, but spiritual. The dead arrived as shadows, shades, breathless and bloodless, stripped of voice and form, and crossed into Hades with the aid of Charon, the ferryman. For a coin, he ferried them across Acheron. Those unburied properly, those who could not pay, were left to wander the banks for 100 years, whispering and weeping. At the entrance, souls were met by Cerberus, the 3-headed hound that kept the dead in and the living out. Beyond him stretched the asphodel meadows, gray and dim, where most souls drifted in forgotten silence, murmuring like dry leaves. But not all fates were equal. The underworld had its judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, who weighed each soul. The truly impious were cast into Tartarus, an abyss of torment deeper even than the Titan's prison, where oath-breakers, murderers, and traitors suffered torments designed to mirror their crimes. Sisyphus rolled his stone. Tantalus thirsted eternally beside unreachable water, and Ixion spun on his fiery wheel. The rare few deemed worthy of reward passed into the Elysian fields, a paradise of gentle breezes, green meadows, and perpetual spring. There, heroes could abide in comfort, their memories intact, their deeds honored. Still fewer souls might choose to be reborn, passing through the river Lethe to forget their former lives, beginning the cycle anew. In later mystery religions, a soul might even hope to escape the wheel entirely and ascend to the stars. But such fates were rare and uncertain. At the heart of this realm was Hades, grim and silent, a king without vanity. He sought no worship, interfered not in mortal affairs. He simply ruled, and ruled absolutely. His dominion remained immutable, a state he fervently preferred. He was not malevolent, as later mythologies would caricature him, but unyielding, detached, a mere silhouette cast by Zeus's tempest and Poseidon's tide. And by his side resided Persephone, queen of the underworld, whose narrative, perhaps more than any other, elucidates the curious duality of death within the Greek psyche. Persephone was the scion of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. One vernal day, whilst gathering blossoms, the earth sundered and Hades emerged in his chariot. He spirited her away summarily and without her assent to his subterranean realm. Demeter, consumed by grief, rendered the earth barren. The harvests failed, the rivers desiccated. Famine stalked the land. No supplication could mollify her. She vowed the world would not flourish anew until her daughter was restored. At length, Zeus dispatched Hermes to retrieve Persephone. Yet, having partaken of pomegranate seeds, 6, or perhaps merely 1, she was irrevocably bound to Hades. The pact evolved into a mythos for the seasons. Persephone would sojourn in the netherworld for a portion of the year, and during these months, Demeter would lament, and the world would grow cold. Upon Persephone's return, the earth would effloresce. Life and death coalesced into a cycle, not an irrevocable sentence. In time, Persephone's role underwent metamorphosis. No longer a mere captive, she ascended to the status of a sovereign in her own right, a queen of mysteries who traversed the shadows with an august, silent authority. Within the Eleusinian mysteries, the profound secret rites observed beyond the confines of Athens, her descent and subsequent reappearance were reenacted annually, heralding not only the resurgence of grain, but also the promise of spiritual regeneration. The underworld was not an entirely sealed abyss. Certain mortals ventured therein and returned to recount their experiences. Orpheus, with his lyre, navigated past Cerberus and captivated Hades and Persephone, only to forfeit Eurydice through a solitary backward glance. Heracles, in his might, conveyed Cerberus to the terrestrial realm. Odysseus, under Circe's guidance, offered libations to the departed and conjured the specters of Tiresias, Achilles, and Agamemnon. Each, in their ghostly pronouncements, conveyed that death held no glory, merely finality. It is preferable to be a serf in life than a monarch among shades, declared Achilles, once the paramount of Hellenes. And thus, the Greeks meticulously constructed their sepulchres. They interred the deceased with obols for Charon, accompanied by arms, libations of wine, and hymns. They poured libations and rendered offerings at the ancestral hearth, for the departed were never truly absent. They haunted dreams, sent omens, and sometimes, through ritual and blood, could even be entreated for answers better left unasked. The underworld was a mirror of life, of memory, of justice without appeal. It offered no paradise for the faithful, nor hell for the unbelieving. It simply existed, vast and dark, presided over by a god who sought not love or prayers, but silence. In that quietude, the Greeks saw the shape of eternity. And in the stories they told of Hades and Persephone, of shadows and judgment, of rivers and thrones beneath the earth, they gave death its place in the order of the cosmos, not as punishment, but as passage. Even the gods are not immortal, not in memory, not in power, and not in reverence. There comes a time in every mythic cycle when the divine grows quiet, where once vivid figures fade from the edges of men's dreams, and thrones once built of thunder are worn smooth by time. For the gods of Olympus, that slow receding began not with war or prophecy, but with Rome, and with a world that had grown restive under the weight of old stories. The Romans did not destroy the Greek gods. They adopted them, gave them new names, folded their myths into Roman values and Roman conquest. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Poseidon became Neptune, and so on. An act of transformation as calculated as it was reverent. Rome admired Olympus's grandeur, but it reshaped the gods to better reflect its own ideals. Order, hierarchy, empire. Jupiter thundered not from a wild peak, but from the Capitoline hill, clad in the robes of a lawmaker. Dionysus's wildness became the civilized Bacchus, and Athena's fierce independence softened into Minerva's civic wisdom. In literature, the myths continued to live on. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, retold the old stories in Golden Latin, often with irony, always with poetic grace. Virgil in the Aeneid made the gods instruments of fate, pulling strings behind the very founding of Rome. But something had changed from Homer. The gods strode the battlefield, naked in their passions, visible in the dust and blood. In Roman myth, they became symbolic, distant, politicized. They no longer intervened quite so freely. They became themes rather than presences. And as the empire expanded, so too did its encounters with new gods and ideas. From the east came Mithras, a divinity born of rock, slayer of cosmic bulls. From Egypt came Isis, mother of magic and life, swathed in silks and secrets. From Judea came a single unseen god, one who forbade images, disdained idols, and left no room for divine brethren or thunder-wielding kings. These new cults did not merely compete with the Olympians. They undermined the entire architecture of Greek belief. Where the old gods ruled by appetite and hierarchy, these new faiths offered moral clarity, unity, and salvation. Simultaneously, philosophy began to erode the mythic world from within. Thinkers like Xenophanes had long mocked the notion of gods fashioned in man's image, arguing that if oxen had gods, theirs too would resemble bovines. Plato admired the beauty of myth, but cast doubt on its literal truth, suggesting gods ought to be perfect and good, not the jealous, lecherous figures bickering on Olympus. Epicurus declared that gods existed but were indifferent to human affairs, and that fear of divine retribution was a superstition to be shed. Even Stoicism, with its austere ethical code, saw divinity not in figures, but in reason itself, the logos that governed all. When the imperial cult arose, when emperors were declared divine and altars were raised to mortal men, the line between myth and politics dissolved entirely. The old gods became symbols. Their temples maintained more by tradition than by belief. Farmers still left offerings to Demeter, and sailors still prayed to Poseidon, but few truly believed the gods walked among them. The flame on Olympus had not yet been extinguished, but it flickered low. And then came the final blow, not from a rival cult, but a revolution of faith. Christianity, once a fringe sect of persecuted believers, began to spread through the empire, carried not by sword, but by word. Its God was unseen, singular, and omnipotent. Its stories were not of lovers and vengeance, but of sin and salvation. In time, its temples supplanted the old. Its hymns drowned out the liars. Its priests denounced the Olympians as demons or figments. By the reign of Theodosius I, pagan temples were shuttered by law, the Olympic Games abolished, and sacrificial rites forbidden. The gods did not resist. There was no final war between Zeus and Christ. There was no divine siege of Jerusalem or Rome. The Olympians simply faded, like the last light of a long day. Their statues remained weathered and silent. Their altars grew cold. Marble columns cracked, and ivy climbed where priests once stood. The myths remained, but as literature, not faith. Children learned of Heracles in schools, not sanctuaries. Artists painted Athena, but did not pray to her. The gods who once commanded storms and destinies were now stories, beautiful, strange, terrifying, and yet they endured. Even as their temples crumbled, they lived on in whispers, in poetry, in the architecture of Western imagination. They returned in Renaissance paintings, in Enlightenment philosophy, in romantic epics, and modern retellings. They became archetypes of war and wisdom, of love and betrayal, of hubris and glory. The Greeks had given them human faces, and in doing so, had made them eternal in a different way. Though temples fell and oracles fell silent, the myths of Olympus did not die. They became echoes, faint at first, like a distant lyre played on the wind, then louder with time, and the world once again began to listen. For myths, unlike kingdoms, are not bound by stone and sword. They endure in the realm of imagination, and there the gods have always found a way to return. Through the long centuries of Christian dominion in Europe, the gods were not worshipped, but neither were they forgotten. Monks and scholars copied ancient texts, sometimes reluctantly preserving Homer and Hesiod, Euripides and Sophocles, even as they condemned the beliefs those works once sustained. The old stories survived not in temples, but in libraries, hidden among sermons and treatises, waiting. And then came the Renaissance, that great turning of the wheel when Europe looked back to move forward. In the courts of Florence, in the chapels of Rome, in the minds of thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus, the gods resurfaced, not as deities, but as symbols of human nature. Painters clothed Aphrodite in shells and light. Sculptors gave Apollo his bow and grace. Poets invoked the muse once more. Myth was reborn in marble and canvas, not on altar and incense. The gods no longer ruled the heavens, but they reigned in art. In the age of enlightenment, reason challenged superstition, and yet the myths endured. They were studied, translated, dissected. For Voltaire, they were allegories. For Goethe, they were mirrors of the soul. Romanticism followed, and with it, a return to the emotional, the tragic, the sublime. Writers looked to Oedipus and Antigone, to Orpheus and Eurydice, and found in them eternal questions. What is destiny? What is love? What does it mean to be human? Then came the modern age. Myth was no longer confined to classical study. It appeared in literature, in film, in psychology, even in comic books. Carl Jung saw the gods as archetypes within the human mind, eternally re-emerging. James Joyce wove them into the streets of Dublin. Rick Riordan reimagined them for schoolchildren in Manhattan. In Marvel and DC, gods walked again, not in togas and sandals, but in armor and spandex. And always in the background, the old stories remained, unaltered. Odysseus still sailed, Heracles still toiled. Persephone still ascended each spring. They were not forgotten. They were simply translated, generation after generation, into new forms, new languages, new dreams. Because myth is not fixed. It is living memory, shaped by those who carry it. What the Greeks gave us was not just a pantheon, but a framework, a way to explain the world, to grapple with death, to honor beauty, to understand the self. Their gods were flawed, yes, but gloriously so. In them, we saw not perfection, but potential, the agony of choice, the thrill of risk, the pain of hubris, the comfort of ritual. They told us what we could become and what we must fear. Even now, in a world of science and silence, myths still whisper. You hear them in tales of chosen heroes, in shooting stars, in the slow turning of the seasons. A girl descends and spring waits. A king defies prophecy and loses all. A mother mourns the sun. The faces change, but the truths do not. The gods may have left Olympus, but they never truly left us. They walk silently now in books and songs, in dreams and memories, in every story that dares to reach beyond the mortal veil. They are not dead. They have merely relocated. And now the story ends. The winds on Mount Olympus are cold. The torches at Delphi are ash. But the myths endure. Good night. The Roman Empire's expansion transcended mere territorial conquest. It also assimilated and reinterpreted the Greek pantheon, an act of cultural syncretism that profoundly shaped the perception of the divine for centuries. By renaming Zeus to Jupiter, Hera to Juno, Poseidon to Neptune, and so forth, The Romans not only adapted the appellations, but also imbued these deities with their own values of order, hierarchy, and imperial pragmatism. Jupiter, for instance, transitioned from merely the thunderous god of Olympus to the sovereign of the Capitoline Hill, a legislator whose decrees mirrored the authority of the Senate itself. Dionysus's wild abandon was tempered into the figure of Bacchus, more closely associated with the refined pleasures of wine and organized festivities, while Athena's martial independence was transmuted into Minerva's civic wisdom, a goddess who safeguarded the city and its institutions. This divine metamorphosis, though seemingly superficial in nomenclature, signified a fundamental shift in how divine power was conceptualized and wielded. This reinterpretation, however, was not devoid of subtlety. In literature, authors such as Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, employed Latin to retell old Greek stories, often with a touch of irony and a poetic grace that allowed for a more complex and even critical reading of the original myths. Virgil, in turn, in the Aeneid, elevated the gods to mere instruments of fate, orchestrating events to ensure the foundation and future of Rome. Unlike the direct and passionate intervention of the gods in Homer's Iliad, where they became involved in battles with their own exposed emotions and rivalries, the Roman gods became more distant, more symbolic. Divine intervention was no longer manifested in heroic deeds on the battlefield, but in designs that favored Rome's expansion and glory. This transition from active divine presences to symbolic figures paved the way for the rise of new forms of belief. Concurrently with this domestication of the Olympian pantheon, the vast Roman Empire became receptive to religious influences from all quarters. From the east emerged Mithras, an enigmatic deity linked to stone and the sacrifice of a cosmic bull, whose mysteries were observed in clandestine rites. From Egypt, the revered Isis, goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing, brought with her a legacy of intricate rituals and assurances of an afterlife. However, it was from Judea that the most disruptive force emerged, a singular invisible god who forbade images and idols, disdained divine multiplicity, and, crucially, left no room for divine brethren or kings wielding thunderbolts. This monotheistic conception, with its emphasis on an omnipotent God and an absolute moral code, presented a direct challenge to the hierarchical and multifaceted structure of Olympian religion. These nascent cults not only vied with the Greek gods, they fundamentally undermined the very bedrock of Olympian belief. Whereas the Hellenic deities reigned through caprice, passion, and an established hierarchical order, the new faiths proffered something radically divergent: moral clarity, unity of purpose, and, paramountly, the promise of salvation. This proposition resonated profoundly within a world increasingly feeling estranged from its ancient narratives. Philosophy, in turn, also contributed to the erosion of mythical influence. Thinkers such as Xenophanes had already lampooned the anthropomorphization of deities, positing that if animals were capable of conceiving gods, they would likely fashion them in their own image. Plato, while appreciating the aesthetic allure of myths, questioned their literal veracity, arguing that gods ought to embody perfection and goodness, rather than the capricious and lascivious figures populating Olympus. Epicurus, conversely, posited that while gods might exist, they remained utterly indifferent to human affairs, and that the dread of divine retribution was merely a superstition to be transcended. Stoicism, with its austere ethical framework, perceived divinity not in anthropomorphic personages, but within reason itself, the logos that governed the cosmos. This intellectual attrition, interwoven with the burgeoning spiritual currents, meticulously paved the way for an epical religious metamorphosis. The ascent of the imperial cult, wherein emperors themselves were deified, marked a pivotal juncture in the relationship between temporal and divine authority. This practice, though rooted in earlier traditions of ruler deification, reached an unprecedented scale with the Roman Empire. Altars erected in the emperor's names were not mere tokens of political fealty. They signified an endeavor to meld earthly authority with celestial transcendence, thereby solidifying state power through the veneration of its ultimate figurehead. This fusion, however, contributed to the dilution of genuine belief in the Olympian deities. For many, the ancient gods began to be perceived more as symbols of tradition and social order than as living, intervening entities. While farmers still offered prayers to Demeter and sailors to Poseidon, the conviction in the active presence of the gods in the mortal realm waned, leaving a vacuum that new spiritual narratives were poised to fill. The luminescence of Olympus, though still discernible, began to dim, heralding a transformation in the world's spiritual landscape. What ensued was a revolution of faith, not characterized by pitched battles or imperial edicts, but by the quiet, persistent propagation of a novel worldview. Christianity, once a fringe sect of persecuted adherents, began to permeate the empire. Its strength lay not in legions or promises of temporal power, but in its narratives of sin, redemption, and a singular, unseen, omnipotent God. This message, radically divergent from Greek polytheism, offered a moral clarity and a hope for salvation that deeply resonated within a society increasingly skeptical of ancient myths. Temples dedicated to the Olympian gods started to yield to churches, and the hymns that once lauded Zeus and Apollo were gradually muted by the chants of a new creed. Law, under emperors like Theodosius I, sealed the fate of ancient rites, interdicting sacrifice and shuttering temples, thereby marking the formal demise of an era. Faced with this transformation, the Olympian gods offered no armed resistance. There was no final war between Zeus and Christ, nor a divine siege of Jerusalem or Rome. What transpired was a gradual fading, akin to the last light of a day drawing to a close. Their once venerated statues grew weathered and silent. Their altars grew cold, and ivy began to enshroud the marble columns where priests had once uttered their rituals. The myths, however, did not perish entirely. They transmuted, migrating from the realm of faith to the domain of literature and art. The tales of Heracles came to be studied in schools, no longer revered in sanctuaries. The image of Athena, once a focal point of devotion, became a theme for artists, but no longer an object of prayer. The gods, who once commanded the forces of nature and destiny itself, now existed as narratives, beautiful, strange, and hauntingly evocative. Nevertheless, the cessation of their public worship did not signify their complete disappearance. Even with the decline of their temples and the silencing of their oracles, the Olympian myths found new avenues for resonance. In Christian Europe, monks and scholars, albeit reluctantly, preserved ancient texts, keeping alive the verses of Homer, the tales of Hesiod, and the tragedies of Euripides and Sophocles. These narratives, sequestered in libraries amidst sermons and theological treatises, patiently awaited a moment of rediscovery. That moment arrived with the Renaissance, a period of cultural effervescence that looked to the classical past for inspiration to shape the future. In Italian courts, Roman chapels, and the minds of humanists such as Petrarch and Erasmus, the Greek gods re-emerged, no longer as deities to be revered, but as potent symbols of the human condition. Renaissance art, in particular, embraced the ancient gods with a rekindled ardor. Aphrodite was depicted emerging from the waters, swathed in shells and celestial light, while sculptors restored Apollo's grace and bow. Poets rediscovered the invocation of the Muses, finding in ancient narratives an inexhaustible fount of beauty and meaning. The gods, though divested of their celestial power, came to reign supreme in the realm of art, inspiring works that celebrated both the human form and emotional depth. This artistic revitalization demonstrated that, even stripped of their religious authority, myths possessed an intrinsic potency, an ability to capture the essence of human experience that transcended the passage of time and the shift in beliefs. The human imagination, once touched by these stories, would no longer let them go entirely. The enduring presence of Greek myths through the ages, particularly in the wake of Christianity's ascendancy, demonstrates a remarkable capacity for adaptation and reinterpretation. Far from being mere remnants of a pagan past, the Olympian and heroic narratives were assimilated into the European consciousness, finding renewed relevance in disparate contexts. Throughout the protracted Middle Ages, during which the Church wielded almost hegemonic sway over cultural and intellectual output, classical texts, including the works of Homer and Hesiod, were meticulously preserved by monks and scholars within monasteries and libraries. These custodians of knowledge, even while denouncing the pagan beliefs underpinning the myths, acknowledged their literary and historical import, thereby guaranteeing their survival for posterity. This preservation, often undertaken with a blend of reverence and apprehension, allowed the tales of gods and heroes to patiently await their eventual cultural resurgence. With the advent of the Renaissance, this waiting period drew to a close. In centers of artistic and intellectual efflorescence, such as Florence and Rome, thinkers and artists rediscovered the beauty, complexity, and profound humanity of Greek myths. Figures like Petrarch and Erasmus pioneered the reinterpretation of the gods not as divine entities to be worshipped, but as potent archetypes mirroring the nuances of human nature. Visual art became a paramount vehicle for this rediscovery. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, was frequently depicted emerging from the waters, adorned with shells and bathed in an ethereal luminescence, while sculptors restored to Apollo his classical grace and the imposing presence of his bow. Poetry, in turn, rediscovered the potency of invoking the muses, finding in ancient narratives an inexhaustible wellspring of inspiration for exploring universal themes such as love, loss, ambition, and the human condition itself. Thus, the Olympian gods, divested of their celestial might, came to reign supreme in the realm of art, demonstrating that their influence transcended the religious sphere. While the Age of Enlightenment championed reason and critical inquiry, it did not diminish the allure of myths. On the contrary, these narratives were subjected to rigorous intellectual scrutiny. Philosophers such as Voltaire perceived myths as intricate allegories, metaphors imbued with profound philosophical truths pertaining to society and morality. Goethe, in turn, explored myths as mirrors of the human soul, delving into the depths of the psyche through the odysseys of heroes like Oedipus and tragic figures such as Antigone. The subsequent Romantic movement further intensified this exploration, prizing the emotional, tragic, and sublime elements inherent in ancient narratives. Tales of inescapable destiny, overwhelming passions, and struggles against superior forces provided fertile ground for Romantic writers to probe the complexities of the human experience, thereby reaffirming the perennial relevance of myths for comprehending fundamental questions concerning the nature of fate, the potency of love, and the very essence of human existence. The contemporary era has further expanded the reach and diversity of mythical manifestations. Myth has transcended its exclusive domain within classical studies to permeate literature, cinema, psychology, and even comic books. Carl Jung, in his analysis of archetypes, identified the Greek gods as universal manifestations of the human psyche, patterns of behavior and experience that resurface repeatedly throughout history. James Joyce, in his monumental work, intricately wove myths into the fabric of modern urban life, while Rick Riordan reimagined them for a young audience, transplanting the adventures of Perseus and Heracles into the settings of Manhattan. Even within superhero universes like Marvel and DC, one can glimpse echoes of the ancient gods, no longer clad in tunics and sandals, but in armor and spandex. These new interpretations, though radically different in form, retain the essence of the original narratives. Odysseus still navigates treacherous seas, Heracles completes his impossible labors, and Persephone, in her cyclical journey, continues to usher in spring to the earth. This capacity for adaptation, for translating the fundamental truths of myths into new languages and contexts, demonstrates the enduring vitality and relevance of the Greek legacy. The essence of myths, after all, lies in their malleability, in their ability to be shaped by the hands of those who transmit them, thereby ensuring their perpetuity across generations. What the Greeks bequeathed to us was not merely a pantheon of flawed deities, but a framework for understanding the world, for confronting mortality, for celebrating beauty, and, crucially, for exploring the depths of the self. In their gods, we find not unattainable perfection, but human potential in all its glory and fragility, the agony of choice, the thrill of risk, the pain of hubris, and the solace of ritual. They showed us not only what we might become, but also what we ought to fear. Thus, even in our world of scientific advancements and cosmic silences, myths continue to whisper. They echo in the narratives of chosen heroes, in the trajectories of shooting stars, in the slow rhythm of the seasons. The faces may change, but the underlying truths remain immutable. The gods may have departed Olympus, but their presence endures with us, walking silently in books and songs, in dreams and memories, in every story that dares to pierce the veil of the mortal. They are not dead. They have merely changed their abode, residing now in the eternal realm of the human imagination. As we contemplate the vast tapestry woven from the threads of Greek mythology, we perceive how the echoes of primordial ages, from chaos to the establishment of Olympus, resonate with a surprising force in our own understanding of the world. The narratives we explore, replete with forbidden loves, epic battles, and relentless fates, are not mere accounts of remote times, but rather complex mirrors of the human condition, projecting on a divine scale our own struggles, passions, and dilemmas. The rise and fall of gods and heroes, the intricate dance between free will and predestination, and the constant negotiation between order and chaos, paint a vivid picture of the forces that shape not only the cosmos, but also the depths of our own souls. Reflecting upon this journey, we are compelled to acknowledge the manner in which the deeds of demigods, such as Heracles and Theseus, transcend individual heroism to become symbols of humanity's capacity to confront monumental adversities, to forge civilizations from ruins, and to leave indelible imprints upon history. Their challenges, often orchestrated by divine caprice or ancestral curses, demonstrate that true greatness resides not merely in physical prowess or cunning, but in resilience amidst tragedy and the incessant pursuit of redemption or legacy. The way these mythological figures, born of the union between the divine and the mortal, navigated between two worlds, personifying both human frailty and potentiality, offers a remarkable parallel to our own aspirations and limitations. Upon observing the profound interconnection between the actions of deities and the vicissitudes of human existence, one discerns a recurrent pattern of cause and effect that spans generations, frequently embodied in the familial intrigues and divine retributions that have shaped the trajectory of mythical history. The manner in which prophecies, oaths, and omens have woven an intricate web of events, wherein each action, however minute, appeared to carry cosmic repercussions, compels us to contemplate the very nature of our own destiny. The inescapable inevitability that loomed over the central figures, be they monarchs, heroes, or gods themselves, invites profound reflection on human agency within a cosmos where greater forces seem to orchestrate the unfolding of events. As we draw nearer to the conclusion of this exploration, it becomes manifestly clear that Greek myths, at their core, are not merely tales of gods and monsters, but rather a veritable repository of ancestral wisdom concerning the human condition and the cosmic order. The sagas of love that defied fate, the conflicts that irrevocably reshaped civilizations, and the quests that fundamentally defined the very essence of heroism, all converge upon a singular realization: the understanding that life, in its totality, represents a complex interplay between the known and the apprehended, between established order and the ever-present specter of chaos. The remarkable manner in which these narratives have been perpetuated across millennia, undergoing adaptation and metamorphosis to resonate with successive audiences and evolving contexts, serves as a profound testament to their intrinsic vitality and their enduring capacity to address humanity's most deeply ingrained aspirations and anxieties. Throughout this odyssey across the realms of Greek mythology, we have unveiled not merely celestial intrigues and heroic epics, but also a profound mirror to the human experience itself. We have witnessed how the actions of the gods, with their overwhelming passions and their flaws as earthly as our own, shape the destinies of mortals and immortals alike, weaving a collective fate where love, war, ambition, and tragedy are inextricably intertwined. The saga of Zeus, the sagacity of Athena, the wrath of Poseidon, and the sorrow of Demeter are not simply chapters from an ancient narrative. They are echoes of the forces that continue to shape our lives, our relationships, and our understanding of the world even today. The sagas of heroes such as Heracles and Theseus impart to us that true greatness is not found in the absence of weakness, but rather in the fortitude to confront one's own inner demons and surmount the constraints imposed by fate or nature itself. Through their labors and their struggles, they illuminate for us that strength, sagacity, and tenacity, even when confronted with overwhelming odds, can forge a legacy that transcends mortal existence. Their odysseys, etched with both resplendent triumphs and profound tribulations, stand as a testament that humanity, in its very core, is defined not by flawlessness, but by the capacity to persevere, to assimilate knowledge, and to leave an indelible imprint upon the fabric of time. We perceive that, behind the grandeur of divine deeds and the valor of heroes, resides a fundamental truth: the interconnectedness of all things. Apollo's arrow that brought the plague, Hera's curse that haunted Heracles, the prophecy that guided Oedipus's destiny, all demonstrate how the actions of an individual, be they deity or mortal, reverberate through the cosmos, affecting countless lives. This intricate web of cause and effect invites us to reflect upon the responsibility that accompanies each choice, each word, each act, and how our own lives, however seemingly humble, contribute to the vast narrative of existence. Ultimately, the stories bequeathed to us by the Greeks transcend mere narratives. They serve as an invitation to introspection. They impress upon us that destiny, while formidable, is not invariably immutable, and that sagacity, valor, and even empathy can, on occasion, tip the scales. Though the gods may have departed Olympus, their essence, their foibles and virtues, persists within us, embodied in the tales we recount, the principles we cherish, and the manner in which we confront the trials of our own existence. True practice commences now, not within edifices of stone, but in the hearts and minds that dare to carry forward the torch of these ancient wisdoms, discerning in each myth a reflection of our own human odyssey, with all its triumphs, its sorrows, and its enduring splendor.